Welcome to Sheriff Files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. We all thought that house burned down in '62. But last night, it showed up on Miller Road like nothing ever happened. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 43 years now, and in all that time, I've learned to trust my gut about things that don't sit right. This morning, staring at the coffee rings on my desk blotter and listening to the radiator knock against the October chill, I keep coming back to that house. The Kemper place, we used to call it. The old Henrik Kemper's been dead longer than most folks around here have been breathing. The thing is, I remember the fire. Hell, I helped fight it. I was just a deputy then, barely 22, and the volunteer fire department was nothing but a truck with a busted ladder and good intentions. By the time we got out to Kemper's property on the old Grayson Road, the whole structure was already gone. Nothing left but a foundation full of ash, and the smell of burnt timber that hung in the air for weeks after. That was November of 1962. 61 years ago, give or take a season. So when Martha Henley called the station yesterday evening, voice shaking like autumn leaves, telling me there was a house sitting pretty as you please on Miller Road where no house had any business being, I figured she'd been at the cooking sherry again. Martha's got a reputation for seeing things that ain't there, especially after her husband passed last spring. But Martha's never been one to call the law unless she means it. I drove out to Miller Road just as the sun was setting, casting those long shadows that make everything look wrong somehow, like the world's tilted just a degree off true. Miller Road's nothing but a quarter-mile stretch of cracked asphalt that dead ends at the old quarry. Used to be a logging road back when the mill was running, but these days it mostly serves as a place for teenagers to drink warm beer and pretend they're not afraid of the dark. The house was there, all right. Sitting about 50 yards back from the road, nestled between two oak trees that I could have sworn weren't quite that big last time I'd been out this way. A simple 2-story farmhouse, white clapboard siding gone gray with age, green shutters hanging just a little crooked. The kind of house you see 1,000 times in rural New England, nothing special about it except for the fact that it shouldn't exist. I parked the cruiser and sat there for a good 5 minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The house had that settled look, like it had been there for decades. Weeds grew up around the foundation. Paint peeled from the window trim in familiar patterns. Even the front porch sagged in the exact same spot where I remembered Henrik Kemper's porch sagging, back when I was a boy riding my bicycle past his place on summer afternoons. The more I looked at it, the more details came flooding back. The way the chimney leaned just slightly to the left. The single dormer window that never seemed to catch the light right. The apple tree by the side yard, gnarled and twisted, heavy with fruit that no one ever picked. It was the Kemper house. Every board and shingle of it. I got out of the car and walked closer, my boots crunching on gravel that sounded too loud in the evening quiet. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else underneath it, something sweet and cloying that caught in the back of my throat. As I approached the front steps, I noticed the mailbox leaning at the end of a dirt driveway that definitely hadn't been there an hour earlier. The name on the box was faded but readable, KEMPR. The front door was painted dark green, same as I remembered. Same brass knocker shaped like a pineapple. Same scuff marks near the bottom where Henrik's old hound used to scratch to get in. I reached out to touch the door, just to prove to myself it was real, and stopped with my hand inches from the wood. Through the window beside the door, I could see lamplight. Warm, yellow light spilling across what looked like a living room. I pressed my face to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to cut the glare. Inside, everything was just as I remembered from the few times I'd been in the Kemper house as a child. The same threadbare rug. The same horsehair sofa with the torn arm. The same framed photographs on the mantelpiece, though I couldn't make out the faces from where I stood. And in the corner, in the old wooden rocking chair that Henrik used to favor, sat a figure. I couldn't see much from that angle, just the suggestion of someone sitting there in the lamplight, perfectly still. The chair wasn't moving. Whoever was in it wasn't moving either. But the light fell across them in a way that made me think of photographs, of images burned into old film and left to yellow in forgotten albums. I knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the evening air. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out that I was the sheriff. Still nothing. But as I stood there on that porch, listening to the silence, I started to notice other things. The boards beneath my feet didn't creak the way old wood should. The paint on the door looked fresh up close, but when I glanced away and looked back, it seemed weathered and peeling again. And somewhere inside the house, so faint I might have imagined it, I could hear the sound of a radio playing music from another era. I tried the door handle. Locked, of course. I walked around the house, checking windows, looking for another way in or at least a better view of whoever was sitting in that chair. All the windows were dark except for the front room, and the curtains were drawn too tight to see much of anything. But as I made my circuit, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were no power lines running to the house. No telephone wires. No mailbox at the road. The one I'd seen earlier was gone, along with the dirt driveway. And when I looked back toward Miller Road, my patrol car seemed farther away than it should have been, as if the distance between the house and the road had stretched while I wasn't paying attention. I got out of there fast, walking quickly back to the cruiser without looking over my shoulder. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror and saw the house still sitting there in the gathering darkness, that single window glowing like a yellow eye. Back at the station, I called Tom Bradley, who's lived on Miller Road his whole life. Tom's old enough to remember the Kemper place, and sharp enough to know his own neighborhood. "Tom," I said, "you been home all evening?" "Sure have, Sheriff." "Why? You notice anything unusual on your road today? Any construction, maybe? New buildings going up?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Can't say that I have. But now that you mention it, I did hear some trucks earlier today. Big ones sounded like. Figured they were heading to the quarry." "What time was that?" "Oh, around noon, I'd say. Woke me up from my nap." I thanked Tom and hung up, then sat in my office chair staring at the wall map of Millbrook County. Miller Road was marked with a thin red line, a short dead-end street that terminated at the old gravel quarry. I'd driven that road 100 times in 43 years. There had never been a house there. The next morning, I drove back out to Miller Road. The house was gone. Not a trace of it remained. No foundation, no disturbed ground, no apple tree. Just an empty field covered with morning dew, and the kind of silence that makes you want to whisper. I walked the area where the house had been, looking for any sign that it had ever existed. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed, covered with the same scrub grass and weeds that grew everywhere else along the road. I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, if not for the phone call that came in around 10 o'clock. "Sheriff?" It was Dolores McKinnon, who lives out on Route 9. "I hope you don't think I'm crazy, but there's a house in my backfield that wasn't there yesterday." Route 9 is on the opposite side of town from Miller Road. A good 15 miles as the crow flies. I drove out to the McKinnon place with my deputy, Ray Custis, who's been with the department for 8 years and has a good head on his shoulders. Dolores met us in her driveway, wringing her hands and pointing toward the field behind her barn. "It was there when I got up this morning," she said. "Just sitting there like it owned the place. I asked my husband if he'd seen it before, and he just looked at me like I was speaking in tongues. The house sat in the middle of the field, maybe 200 yards from the McKinnon farmhouse. Same white clapboard siding, same green shutters, same sagging front porch. The Kemper house, no doubt about it. Ray whistled low. How the hell does a house just appear in the middle of a field? I didn't have an answer for him. We walked out across the field, our boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. The house looked exactly as it had the night before, down to the lamplight glowing in the front window. As we got closer, I could see that the grass around the foundation was yellowed and flat, as if the house had been sitting there for months. "Sheriff," Ray said, stopping about 20 feet from the front porch. "You smell that?" I smelled it. The same sweet, cloying odor I'd noticed the night before, but stronger now. Like flowers left too long in a vase, or fruit gone soft with rot. "What do you think it is?" Ray asked. "Nothing good," I said. We approached the house together, Ray's hand resting on his service weapon. I tried the front door again, still locked, and peered through the same window. The living room looked exactly the same, right down to the figure sitting motionless in the rocking chair. This time, though, I could see the figure more clearly. It was an old man, thin and pale, wearing what looked like a dark suit. His hands were folded in his lap, and his head was tilted slightly to one side, as if he were listening to something. The lamplight fell across his face in a way that made his features look sharp and hollow. Henrik Kemper had been dead for over 40 years. "Ray," I said quietly, "go back to the car and radio for backup." "You want me to call the state police?" "I want you to call Doc Morrison. Tell him to bring his medical bag and maybe something stronger." Ray looked confused but did as I asked. While he was gone, I walked around the house again, this time taking photographs with the old Polaroid camera I keep in the cruiser for crime scenes. The pictures came out strange, overexposed in some places, too dark in others, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on what it was seeing. When Ray came back, he had Doc Morrison with him. Doc's been the county coroner for 30 years, and he's seen enough weird things to take most situations in stride. But when he saw the house sitting in the middle of Dolores McKinnon's field, he just stood there shaking his head. "That's not possible," he said. "Tell that to the house," I replied. Doc walked with us to the front porch, his medical bag in one hand and a bottle of something that wasn't medical in the other. He took a long look through the window, studying the figure in the rocking chair. "That's Henrik Kemper," he said finally. "Can't be. Henrik's been dead since 1978. "I know. I signed his death certificate." Doc took a pull from his bottle and passed it to me. "But that's him, all right. Same suit he was buried in." We tried everything we could think of to get into that house. The windows were locked from the inside. The back door was painted shut. Even the cellar door, which I found half hidden under a tangle of vines, wouldn't budge. It was as if the house had sealed itself against the outside world. By evening, word had gotten around town. People started showing up to see the impossible house for themselves. They came in cars and pickup trucks, parking along Route 9 and walking across the field like it was some kind of attraction. Most folks just stared from a distance, but a few of the younger ones got brave enough to approach the porch. That's when things started getting ugly. Billy Towers, who's about 19 and full of the kind of stupid courage that comes with youth, decided he was going to break down the front door. He got about halfway up the porch steps when he started screaming. Not yelling, not shouting, screaming like something was tearing him apart from the inside. We pulled him back, and he couldn't stop shaking long enough to tell us what had happened. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and he kept mumbling about cold hands and whispers. Doc gave him something to calm down. but Billy didn't say another coherent word for 3 days. After that, I set up a perimeter and kept everyone back. But the house stayed there all night, that yellow light burning in the front window, casting long shadows across the field. The next morning, it was gone again. Over the following weeks, the house appeared 7 more times in different locations around Millbrook County. Always the same house, always with the lamplight in the front window, always with that figure sitting motionless in the rocking chair. It showed up behind the old Methodist church, in the middle of the town common, at the edge of the cemetery, and once, memorably, right in the center of Main Street at 3 in the morning. Each time, I documented it. Took photographs, made notes, interviewed witnesses. The pattern was always the same. The house would appear sometime during the night, stay for 12 to 18 hours, then vanish without a trace. No one ever saw it arrive or leave. It was just there, and then it wasn't. The strangest incident happened on a Tuesday in late November. The house had appeared in the parking lot of Miller's hardware store, sitting between 2 pickup trucks like it had been parked there for years. I was examining the foundation when I heard the front door creak open. Henrik Kemper stepped out onto the porch. He looked exactly as I remembered him from childhood, except for his eyes. They were completely black, like holes burned in old paper. He stood there for a long moment, looking directly at me, and then he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Sheriff," he said, and his voice sounded like wine through dry leaves. "You've been very persistent." I tried to speak but found I couldn't make my throat work properly. "This house has been looking for something," Henrik continued. "For someone. For 61 years it's been searching." "What does it want?" I managed to ask. Henrik's smile widened, showing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "What it's always wanted. What was taken from it." He turned and walked back into the house, closing the door behind him with a sound like a coffin lid falling shut. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, before I found the courage to approach the porch again. The door was locked, of course, and when I peered through the window, the living room was empty. No furniture, no lamplight, no figure in the rocking chair. Just empty rooms filled with shadows and the smell of something long dead. The house disappeared that night and didn't return for 2 weeks. When it finally reappeared, it was in my own backyard. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of creaking floorboards. At first, I thought someone was in my house, but as I lay there listening, I realized the sound was coming from outside. I got up and looked out my bedroom window, and there it was, the Kemper house, sitting maybe 50 feet from my back porch, glowing with that familiar yellow light. This time, I could see movement in the windows. Shadows passing back and forth, as if the house was suddenly full of people. I could hear voices, too, faint but distinct, carrying across the cold night air. They sounded like they were having a party. I got dressed and went outside, my service weapon in my hand, though I doubted it would do much good against whatever was in that house. As I approached, the voices grew clearer. I could make out individual words, fragments of conversation. "Should have been there years ago. Fire wasn't supposed to take everyone. Waiting so long." The front door was standing open. I stepped onto the porch and peered inside. The living room was full of people, maybe 20 or 30 of them, all dressed in clothing from decades past. They were standing around talking quietly, holding drinks in their hands, behaving like guests at a cocktail party. But something was wrong with the scene. It took me a moment to realize what it was. None of them were casting shadows, and they were all looking at me. The conversation stopped abruptly. Every face in the room turned in my direction, and I saw that they all had the same black, empty eyes as Henrik Kemper. They stared at me for a long moment, and then, As one, they began to smile. "Sheriff," said a woman in a blue dress from the 1940s. "We've been waiting for you." "Come in," said a man in a work shirt and suspenders. "The party's just getting started. We have so much to show you," said Henrik Kemper, appearing at the edge of the crowd. "So much to share." I backed away from the door, but my feet felt heavy, as if the porch boards were holding them in place. The people in the living room began to move toward the door, their movements fluid and wrong, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. "The fire," Henrik said, his voice now coming from right behind me, though I could still see him across the room. "The fire was supposed to cleanse us, Sheriff. Make us pure. But it took something from us instead. It took our anchor to this world. Our connection." "What are you talking about?" I managed to ask. "The children," said the woman in the blue dress. "The fire took the children." And suddenly I understood. The Kemper house had burned in 1962, but it hadn't been empty. There had been a family gathering that night, Henrik's grandchildren visiting from the city. 7 kids, ages 4 to 14, all of them sleeping upstairs when the fire started. They had died in that fire. All of them. The house had been searching for them ever since, moving from place to place, trying to find what it had lost. And somehow, someway, it had decided that I was the key to getting them back. "We don't want to hurt you, Sheriff," Henrik said, and now he was standing right in front of me, his black eyes reflecting the lamplight like oil slicks. "We just want you to help us find them. Help us bring them home." "They're dead," I said. "They've been dead for 60 years. Death is just another room in the house," Henrik replied. "And all rooms can be opened with the right key." He reached out to touch my face with fingers that felt like ice wrapped in old leather. The moment his skin made contact with mine, I saw them. The children. 7 small figures standing in a circle in a place that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light, holding hands and waiting. They had been waiting for 61 years. "Bring them to us," Henrik whispered. "Bring them home." I woke up in my own bed the next morning, sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream, the most vivid, terrifying nightmare of my life. But when I looked out my bedroom window, I could see the impression in the grass where the house had been. A perfect rectangle of yellowed, flattened lawn, as if something heavy had been sitting there for hours. That was 3 months ago. The house hasn't appeared since then, but I know it's still out there somewhere. Still searching. Still waiting for me to do what Henrik Kemper asked. I've thought about it, God help me. I've thought about those 7 children, trapped between worlds for more than half a century, and I've wondered if there might be a way to help them find peace. But every time I consider it, I remember Henrik's smile and those black, empty eyes, and I know that whatever those things in the house are, they're not interested in peace. They want something else. Something darker. The house will be back. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe next year. But it will be back, and when it comes, it will be looking for me. Because I'm the sheriff, and in a small town like Millbrook, the sheriff is supposed to fix things. To make things right. But some things can't be fixed. Some things are broken in ways that go deeper than understanding, deeper than help, deeper than hope. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. I keep my service weapon cleaned and loaded, though I doubt it will do much good when the time comes. I've written all this down so that whoever comes after me will know what they're dealing with. The house burned down in 1962, but fire can't destroy everything. Some things are stronger than flame, stronger than time, stronger than death itself. The house will keep moving, keep searching, keep appearing in impossible places until it finds what it's looking for. and I have the terrible feeling that what it's looking for isn't 7 dead children at all. What it's looking for is the way back into our world permanently. And I think it's getting closer to finding it. The coffee's gone cold in my cup, and the radiator's stopped its knocking. Outside my office window, the first snow of the season is starting to fall, covering Millbrook in a blanket of white that makes everything look clean and peaceful. But I know better now. I know that peace is just an illusion, and cleanliness is just a thin layer over the rot underneath. Somewhere out there, the Kemper house is waiting in whatever space exists between here and there, between now and then, between the living and the dead. And when it comes back, and it will come back, I'll be ready for it. At least I hope I will be. Because if I'm not, if Henry Kemper and his friends manage to open that door they've been looking for, then God help us all. The house that burned down in '62 is still burning. And the fire is spreading. That bell ain't rung since '74. But last night it did. I'd been sheriff in Millhaven for 37 years, and in all that time, I learned to listen to what this town tells you. Sometimes it whispers through the wind that cuts between the old clapboard houses. Sometimes it speaks in the way shadows fall different on certain streets. And sometimes, God help us all, it rings a bell that has no rope, no mechanism, and no earthly reason to make a sound. The morning after that first ring, I sat in my office with coffee gone cold, staring out at Main Street where nothing moved except old Mrs. Patterson's cat picking its way between the potholes. The bell tower of St. Bartholomew's rose above the tree-line like a broken finger pointing at heaven, same as it had for the past 51 years since the congregation abandoned it. Same as it had yesterday morning, when the world still made the kind of sense an old man could live with. But that sound. Christ, that sound was still echoing in my bones. I'd been dreaming about Martha, my Martha, been gone 8 years now, when it woke me. Not jarring, like an alarm. Slow and deliberate, each peal rolling across the valley like thunder that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to storm. I counted them in the dark of my bedroom. 7 strikes. Same as St. Bartholomew's used to call the evening service back when people still believed in evening services. Course, I told myself it was a dream. Had to be. The bell mechanism had been removed in '75, sold for scrap along with everything else worth taking. I should know. I was the one who supervised the salvage crew, making sure nobody made off with the copper gutters or the stained glass windows that were worth something to collectors down in the state capitol. But the next morning, driving past the old church on my routine patrol, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Fresh tire tracks in the weeds around the building. Not mine, not from the county maintenance crew that came through once a year to make sure the structure wasn't ready to fall down on some fool kid's head. These were wide tracks, from something heavy. Recent enough that the morning dew hadn't settled in them yet. I parked the cruiser and walked the perimeter, noting how the autumn weeds had been pressed down in places, like someone had been moving around the building in the dark. The padlock on the front door hung intact, but when I tested it, the metal was warm to the touch despite the October morning chill. Strange thing was, I could smell something on the air around that building. Not decay or mold like you'd expect from a place that's been empty 5 decades. Something else. Something like the way the air smells just before a lightning strike. That evening, I drove by again on my way home. The building squatted in the gathering dusk like it always had, surrounded by its fence of twisted iron and tangled vines. But as I watched from the road, I could swear I saw a flicker of light through one of the boarded windows. Just for a second, like someone had struck a match inside. I sat there with the engine idling, radio crackling with the usual evening chatter from dispatch, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. 37 years of police work teaches you the difference between what's real and what your mind wants to see. But 37 years also teaches you when to trust your gut, and my gut was telling me that St. Bartholomew's was waking up from a long sleep. The second night, the bell rang 12 times. I was ready for it this time, standing on my front porch with a thermos of coffee and my service weapon, though I couldn't have told you what I planned to shoot. The sound rolled across the valley like before, but louder now, more insistent. Each peal seemed to hang in the air longer than the last, overlapping until the whole night was filled with bronze-throated song that had no source. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt wrong. Too complete. Even the crickets had gone quiet, and in Millhaven, the crickets never stop unless something scares them badly enough to forget they're alive. I got in the cruiser and drove toward the church, taking my time, letting the headlights sweep across the familiar landscape. The old parsonage came into view first, its collapsed roof creating shadows that looked like broken teeth. Then the church itself, tall and narrow, its white paint long since weathered to the color of old bones. The front door was standing open. I pulled to the side of the road and killed the engine, but left the lights on. The beam illuminated the doorway, a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. The padlock lay in the weeds beside the steps, not cut or broken, but open clean as if someone had used the right key. Problem was, I had the only key, and it was hanging on my belt where it had been for the past 15 years. I approached the building with my flashlight in one hand and my pistol in the other, following protocols that seemed foolish in the face of whatever was happening here. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, and when I reached the doorway, that smell hit me again, ozone and something else, something organic and warm that reminded me of the way the delivery room smelled when my daughter was born 43 years ago. The beam of my flashlight couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into the interior. The darkness seemed thick, almost viscous, and when I called out, my voice was absorbed so completely it was like shouting into a pillow. I stepped inside. The floorboards were solid under my feet, no rot or give despite decades of neglect. My light played across the walls, revealing the ghosts of where pews once stood, the faded rectangles on the wallpaper where religious paintings had hung. But there were other marks too, strange symbols carved into the wood with fresh cuts that gleamed pale in the flashlight beam. At the far end of the nave, where the altar used to be, someone had arranged objects in careful patterns. Candles that had burned down to pools of wax. Flowers that should have been dead for weeks but still held color in their petals. And in the center of it all, a rope. A new rope, thick as my wrist, hanging down from the darkness above where the bell tower waited. I followed the rope with my light, up through the shadows until I could see where it disappeared through a hole in the ceiling. The same hole that had been sealed with plywood after the bell was removed, except now the plywood hung in splinters around the edges like something had punched through from above. The rope swayed gently, though there was no wind inside the building. I should have left then. Should have backed away and called the state police, let them deal with whatever was happening in my town. But something kept me there, something in the way the rope moved that was almost hypnotic. Almost like it was inviting me to reach out and take hold. When I touched it, the rope was warm. Not just warm, hot, like it had been baking in summer sun despite hanging in the depths of an abandoned building on an October night. The moment my skin made contact, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the bell tower floor. I drew my gun and aimed it at the ceiling, but the footsteps weren't threatening. They were patient, methodical, like someone pacing off the dimensions of a room they knew well. Then the bell rang again, so close and loud that I felt it in my chest cavity, felt it rearrange my heartbeat to match its rhythm. 7 times again, each peal accompanied by the creak of timber, and the whisper of something moving through the air above my head. When the sound faded, the footsteps stopped. And in the silence that followed, I heard my name called from somewhere up in the darkness. Not shouted, not whispered, but spoken in a voice I hadn't heard in 8 years. A voice that belonged to a woman buried in Millhaven Cemetery under a headstone I visited every Sunday after church. "Come up, Earl." Martha's voice drifted down through the hole in the ceiling. "Come see what they've been waiting to show you." I holstered my weapon, took hold of the rope with both hands, and began to climb. The ascent was easier than it should have been for a man my age. The rope held my weight without strain, and my muscles seemed to remember strength they'd lost years ago. As I pulled myself up through the darkness, I could feel the building around me changing, settling into patterns that made sense of things that shouldn't make sense. The bell tower was larger than I remembered from the salvage day 50 years ago. Much larger. The walls stretched away into shadows that my flashlight couldn't reach, and the floor was covered with objects that hadn't been there when the county crew cleaned the place out. There were photographs arranged in neat rows across the wooden planks. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all showing the same thing: the town of Millhaven at different times, different seasons, different decades. But in every photograph, one detail remained constant. The bell tower of St. Bartholomew's stood at the center of each image, and from its peak, a figure watched over the town. The same figure in every photograph. A woman in a white dress, her face turned toward the camera with an expression of infinite patience. Martha stood beside the bell, her hand resting on the bronze surface like she was greeting an old friend. She looked exactly as she had on our wedding day, young and radiant and impossibly alive. The bell itself hung from a framework of timbers that gleamed with fresh varnish, its surface reflecting the light of candles that burned in alcoves around the tower walls. "You were always stubborn about accepting help," she said, and her voice carried the same gentle reproach it had carried in life. "Even when the help was exactly what you needed." I wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions that crowded my throat, but the words wouldn't come. This close to the bell, I could feel its presence like a living thing, patient and vast and older than the building that housed it. "They've been calling to you for years," Martha continued, gesturing to the photographs scattered around us. "Every person who ever lived in this town, everyone who ever called Millhaven home. They don't leave, Earl. They just wait." She picked up one of the photographs and handed it to me. It showed Main Street as it looked in 1923, according to the date penciled on the back. Horse-drawn wagons lined the street, and people in old-fashioned clothes went about their business under a summer sky. But there, in every face turned toward the camera, I saw recognition. They were all looking at me, these people who died before I was born, and their eyes held the knowledge of what I would become. "The bell calls to those who are ready," Martha said. "Those who've served long enough, loved deeply enough, lost enough to understand what comes next." I set the photograph aside and looked at the others scattered across the floor. Different eras, different faces, but all showing the same impossible truth. The people of Millhaven had been waiting for me for longer than I could comprehend. "What do I have to do?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange in the candlelit space, younger than it had in years. Martha smiled and stepped aside, revealing the rope that hung beside the bell. Not the climbing rope I'd used to reach this place, but the bell rope, thick and worn smooth by countless hands. "Just ring it once more," she said. "Ring it for all of us." I took hold of the rope, feeling the weight of the bronze above me, the weight of 50 years of silence, and longer than that of waiting. When I pulled, the bells sang out across the valley with a voice like thunder, like welcome, like coming home. The sound rolled through the night and into the dawn that was already breaking over the eastern hills. It echoed off the mountains and returned to us carrying the voices of everyone who had ever lived in Millhaven, everyone who had ever loved this strange little town enough to stay even after staying was no longer possible. When the sound faded, I was alone in the bell tower. The photographs were gone, the candles extinguished, the framework above me empty of everything except shadows and old wood and the lingering scent of ozone. But the bell remained, hanging silent and patient, waiting for the next time someone would be ready to hear its call. I climbed down the rope and walked out of the church as the sun painted the sky the color of old roses. The door swung shut behind me, and when I tested it, the padlock was secure again, the key hanging heavy on my belt. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the bell has remained silent, and Millhaven has settled back into its usual rhythms. I still make my rounds, still file my reports, still visit Martha's grave every Sunday. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I can hear something moving up in that bell tower. Footsteps pacing across the floor, patient and methodical, like someone waiting for the right moment to ring a bell that most folks don't even remember exists. And sometimes, when the fog rolls down from the mountains and settles thick over the valley, I catch glimpses of figures moving through the streets of my town. People I knew, people I'd forgotten, people who died before I was old enough to know them. They nod when they see me, these patient spirits, and in their eyes I see the knowledge that my time of watching over Millhaven is almost done. The bell ain't rung since that night 3 weeks past. But it will ring again, when the next keeper is ready to answer its call. And when it does, I'll be there waiting, along with Martha and all the others who loved this town enough to never really leave. The bell always finds who it needs, when it needs them. That's just the way it is in places like Millhaven, where the past and present walk the same streets, and the only thing separating the living from the dead is the willingness to listen when something calls your name in the darkness. I've been sheriff here for 37 years, but that's just the beginning of my service to this town. The real work starts when you finally understand what the bell has been trying to tell you all along, that some places choose their guardians, and some guardians never really retire. They just change shifts. His name was Matthew Hale. Or at least, that's what the old case file says. Not a single person in this town remembers him, except me. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years now, and I've seen things that would make your hair stand on end. But the Matthew Hale case, that one's different. That one follows me home at night, sits at the foot of my bed, and whispers questions I can't answer. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September. The kind of morning where the air tastes like copper pennies and the sky looks bruised around the edges. I was going through the cold case files in the basement of the courthouse, boxes upon boxes of forgotten sins and unsolved mysteries that accumulate in a place like this over the decades. Millbrook's the kind of town where secrets grow like weeds in the cracks of old foundations. The file was thin, wedged between a domestic dispute from 1969 and a cattle rustling case from 1972. Missing person report, dated October 15, 1971. Matthew Hale, age 14. Last seen walking home from school on County Road 7. Brown hair, blue eyes, wearing a red flannel shirt and blue jeans. Reported missing by his guardian, a Mrs. Dorothy Hale, who lived at 418 Elm Street. 418 Elm Street. I knew that address. Had to drive past it every day on my way to work. Had been driving past it for 37 years. The house had been empty for as long as I could remember, windows boarded up, yard grown wild, paint peeling like diseased skin. Everyone in town called it the old Hensley place, after the family that used to live there before they moved away sometime in the early 60s. But according to this file, Dorothy Hale had lived there in 1971. Had reported her grandson missing. Had given a detailed description of the boy. Had begged the sheriff's department to find him. I sat in that basement for a long time, reading and rereading the sparse details. The investigating officer was Sheriff Coleman, The man who'd held this job before me, who'd died of a heart attack the same week I'd pinned on the badge. His handwriting was careful, methodical. He'd interviewed neighbors, checked with the school, talked to Matthew's classmates. But even then, even in 1971, people's memories seemed hazy. Classmates couldn't recall sitting with him at lunch. Teachers struggled to remember if he'd been in their classes. The neighbors on Elm Street claimed they'd never seen hide nor hair of any Dorothy Hale, despite the fact that she'd supposedly been living next door to them for years. The case had gone cold within a month. Matthew Hale had simply vanished, as if he'd never existed at all. But someone had filed that report. Someone had remembered him long enough to tell the sheriff he was missing. I drove out to Elm Street that afternoon, parked across from 418, and stared at the abandoned house. It squatted there like a tumor, all sharp angles and shadow. The afternoon sun should have warmed the place, should have made it look less forbidding, but somehow it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The yard was a tangle of wild roses and volunteer elm saplings, grown so thick you could barely make out the front porch underneath. I'd walked past this house as a boy, had dared friends to touch the front gate, had thrown rocks at the boarded windows and run when they clattered against the wood. But I'd never once heard anyone mention the Hales. Never once heard a single story about a missing boy. That evening, I stopped by Meredith's diner for coffee and pie. Meredith Caldwell had been serving coffee and gossip in that same booth for 40 years. If anyone would remember the Hales, it would be her. Dorothy Hale? She wrinkled her forehead, wiped her hands on her apron. Can't say I recall the name. When did she live here? Early 70s. Had a grandson named Matthew. Meredith shook her head slowly. Honey, I've lived in this town my whole life, and I know every family that's come and gone. Never heard of any Hales. I showed her the file, pointed to the address. She studied it with the same expression she might wear looking at a photograph of a flying saucer. That's the old Hensley place, she said finally. Been empty since I was in high school. Never seen anyone living there, not once. But someone had. Someone had called the sheriff's department on October 15, 1971, and reported a missing boy. Someone had given detailed descriptions, had provided school records, had sat in the sheriff's office and cried for her lost grandson. I spent the next 3 days driving through town, stopping at houses, asking questions. Showed the file to anyone who'd been living here in 1971. The responses were all the same: polite confusion, shaking heads, the kind of blank stares you get when you ask someone to remember a dream they never had. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been the school secretary for 30 years, pulled out the attendance records from 1971. No Matthew Hale. No record of any Hale family enrolling a child. The county clerk's office had no record of a Dorothy Hale ever owning property on Elm Street. No death certificate, no tax records, no driver's license. It was as if the entire family had been carefully erased from the town's memory, leaving behind only that single, impossible file. But files don't create themselves. Reports don't write themselves. Someone had sat across from Sheriff Coleman and told him about Matthew Hale. Someone had provided enough detail, enough anguish, enough evidence to convince a career lawman to open an investigation. I started having dreams about the boy. Nothing dramatic, nothing you'd call a nightmare. Just quiet dreams where I'd be walking through town and catch glimpses of him from the corner of my eye. A flash of red flannel disappearing around a corner, a shadow moving past a window, the sound of sneakers on pavement just behind me. In the dreams, he was always just out of reach, always one step ahead, and I had the persistent feeling that if I could just catch up to him, just get a good look at his face, everything would make sense. The dreams started bleeding into my waking hours. I'd be driving through town, and think I saw him walking along the shoulder of the road. I'd turn my head to get a better look and find only empty asphalt and autumn leaves. I'd be sitting in my office and hear what sounded like a boy's voice calling from the street, but when I looked out the window, there'd be no one there. It was during one of these moments, sitting at my desk, certain I'd heard someone calling my name, that I noticed the photograph on the bulletin board behind my chair. It was a picture of the town's centennial celebration from 1973, taken in the park downtown. Must have been 100 people in that photo, all gathered around the bandstand, smiling at the camera. And there, in the back row, partially hidden behind Mrs. Caldwell's shoulder, was a boy in a red flannel shirt. The photograph was old, slightly faded, but I could make out enough detail to see that the boy was the right age, the right build. Brown hair, serious expression, standing slightly apart from everyone else, as if he didn't quite belong. I took the photograph down, studied it under the desk lamp. The more I looked at it, the more certain I became. This was Matthew Hale. This was the missing boy, captured in a photograph taken 2 years after he'd supposedly vanished. But that was impossible. If Matthew had been at the centennial celebration in 1973, then he hadn't gone missing in 1971. If he'd been standing in that crowd, then someone should have recognized him, should have remembered him, should have been able to tell me his story. I spent the weekend making enlargements of the photograph, cropping it to focus on the boy's face. Monday morning, I took the pictures around town, showed them to anyone who'd been at the centennial. The responses were maddeningly consistent. "Oh sure, I remember that day. Great turnout. But do you remember this boy? Do you recognize him?" Blank stares. Head shakes. The kind of confused expressions you might expect if I'd asked them to identify a unicorn. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally said what everyone else was thinking. "Sheriff, there's no boy in that picture." I looked down at the photograph in my hands. There he was, clear as day, brown hair, red flannel shirt, standing right behind Mrs. Caldwell. "Right there," I said, pointing. "Behind Meredith." Mrs. Patterson adjusted her glasses, leaned closer. "I don't see anyone there, honey. Just empty space." I looked again. The boy was still there, still staring back at me with that serious expression. But as I watched, as I really focused on his face, something about the image seemed to shift. The edges grew softer, less defined. The features became harder to make out. "You're seeing things that aren't there," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Maybe you should take a few days off, get some rest." But I knew what I was seeing. I knew Matthew Hale was in that photograph, even if no one else could see him. The question was, what did that mean? That night, I drove back to 418 Elm Street. Parked in the same spot across the road, stared at the dark windows. The house seemed different somehow, more solid than before. The shadows weren't quite as deep, the angles not quite as sharp. It looked almost inhabited. I got out of the car, walked across the street, pushed through the tangle of overgrown hedge that blocked the front gate. The yard was a maze of thorns and dead branches, but I managed to pick my way to the front porch. The boards creaked under my feet, not the groan of rotting wood, but the comfortable settling of a house that remembered being lived in. The front door was painted green, though the paint was faded and peeling. There was a small window set into the upper half, covered from the inside with yellowed lace curtains. I cupped my hands against the glass, tried to peer through the gaps in the fabric. The interior was dark, but I could make out shapes, furniture covered with sheets, a staircase leading to the second floor, family photographs on the mantelpiece. Not the empty shell I'd expected, but a house that looked as if its owners had simply stepped out for the evening and might return at any moment. A light came on in the front room. I jerked back from the window, nearly lost my balance on the porch steps. The light was warm yellow, the kind that comes from table lamps rather than overhead fixtures. Through the lace curtains, I could see movement, shadows shifting across the walls, the suggestion of someone walking through the room. I should have left. Should have gotten back in my car and driven straight home. Should have filed the Matthew Hale case away and forgotten about it. But 37 years of law enforcement had taught me that running from mysteries only makes them stronger. I knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the house, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. Then, from somewhere inside came the soft shuffle of footsteps on hardwood floors. Someone was walking toward the door. The footsteps stopped just on the other side. I could feel a presence there, someone standing inches away, separated only by a few inches of painted wood. Waiting. Mrs. Hale? My voice sounded strange in the evening air, too loud and too small at the same time. My name is Sheriff Morrison. I'd like to talk to you about Matthew. The silence stretched out like a held breath. Then, so softly I almost missed it, came a woman's voice. He's not here. I know, ma'am. That's why I'd like to talk to you. He's been gone so long. The voice was tired, worn thin by years of waiting. So very long. When did you last see him, Mrs. Hale? Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice seemed to come from farther away, as if she was walking back into the house. Every day. I see him every day. The light in the front room flickered, dimmed, went out. The house returned to darkness, leaving me standing alone on the porch with nothing but the sound of wind through dead leaves. I tried knocking again, but there was no response. The house had returned to its abandoned state, as if the conversation had been nothing more than my imagination playing tricks in the dark. But I knew what I'd heard. Someone was living in that house. Someone who remembered Matthew Hale. The next morning, I contacted the county assessor's office, requested a full property history for 418 Elm Street. The records went back to 1923, when the house had been built by William Hensley. The Hensley family had owned it until 1961, when they'd sold it to a developer who'd planned to tear it down and build apartments. The developer had gone bankrupt before the demolition could begin, and the property had sat empty ever since. No record of the Hales. No record of anyone living there after 1961. But someone had answered the door. Someone had spoken to me about Matthew. I started researching the original missing person report more carefully, looking for details I might have missed. Sheriff Coleman's notes were thorough but frustrating. Every lead had dead-ended. Every witness had proved unreliable. It was as if Matthew Hale had been a ghost even before he'd disappeared. There was one detail that caught my attention. Dorothy Hale had told Sheriff Coleman that Matthew was afraid of something. She'd been vague about the specifics, had said only that the boy had been having nightmares, had been reluctant to walk home from school alone. When pressed for more information, she claimed that Matthew believed something in the town was hunting him. Hunting children, she'd said, according to Coleman's notes. Something old. Something that's been here longer than any of us. Coleman had written it off as the fears of a troubled boy, the kind of monster under the bed anxieties that all children experience. But reading it now, 43 years later, in the basement of a courthouse in a town where no one remembered the boy or his grandmother, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a warning. I started paying more attention to the town after that, looking for patterns I might have missed. Millbrook had always been the kind of place where people kept to themselves, where families had deep roots and long memories, where changes came slowly and were often resisted. But now I began to notice things that seemed off. There were gaps in conversations, moments when people would stop mid-sentence and look confused, as if they'd forgotten what they were saying. There were photographs in the Historical Society that showed groups of people with empty spaces where someone should have been standing. There were school yearbooks with pages that seemed to be missing entries, though the page numbers were consecutive, and there were no signs of tampering. Most unsettling were the children. Not all of them, not even most of them, but a few. Children who seemed to walk through town like they were following invisible paths, who would stop and stare at empty spaces as if seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Children who would whisper to corners of rooms where no one was sitting, who would save seats at lunch for friends who never arrived. I started keeping a list of these observations, documenting them the way I would any other investigation. The more I wrote, the clearer the pattern became. There were children in Millbrook who existed in the spaces between memory and forgetting, who cast shadows but left no footprints in the town's collective consciousness. And at the center of it all was Matthew Hale, the boy who had been missing for 43 years but had never really been gone. 2 weeks after my first visit to 418 Elm Street, I returned. This time I came prepared: flashlight, camera, a small tape recorder I'd borrowed from the evidence room. If I was going to document whatever was happening in that house, I wanted proof that others could see and hear. The house looked exactly as it had before, abandoned, overgrown, forgotten. But as I walked up the front path, I noticed that the yard seemed less wild than it had been. The thorns were trimmed back, the walkway cleared of debris. Someone had been maintaining the property, keeping it livable. The green front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, called out a greeting. My voice echoed through empty rooms, but there was no response. The interior was exactly as I'd glimpsed it through the window: furniture covered with sheets, family photographs on the mantelpiece, the comfortable clutter of a house that had been loved and lived in. The photographs drew my attention immediately. They showed a woman in her 60s, gray-haired and kind-faced, standing beside a boy who could only be Matthew Hale. The resemblance to the face in the Centennial photograph was unmistakable. Same brown hair, same serious expression, same sense of standing slightly apart from the world around him. But there was something wrong with the photographs. They seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if the images were never quite settled. In some, Matthew appeared to be smiling. In others, his face was solemn. In one, taken in front of what looked like the town's old schoolhouse, he seemed to be looking directly at the camera with an expression of profound sadness. I photographed the photographs, recorded detailed descriptions of what I was seeing. Then I explored the rest of the house, documenting each room, each piece of furniture, each sign that people had lived here despite all evidence to the contrary. In Matthew's bedroom, I knew it was his from the clothes in the closet, the textbooks on the desk, the baseball glove on the nightstand. I found something that made my blood run cold. Pinned to the wall above the bed was a map of Millbrook, marked with red pins at various locations around town. The pins formed no pattern I could recognize, but each one was connected to the others with red string, creating a web that covered the entire town. At the center of the web, where all the strings converged, was a single black pin stuck into the location of the town park. I was photographing the map when I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, moving from the staircase toward Matthew's bedroom. I turned toward the door, camera still in hand, and waited. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. Through the doorway, I could see a shadow on the hallway wall, the silhouette of a boy, standing perfectly still. "Matthew?" I called softly. The shadow didn't move, didn't respond. But somehow I knew he was listening. "I'm trying to help," I said. "I'm trying to find out what happened to you." The shadow shifted slightly, as if the boy had turned his head. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly through the silent house. "You can't help. No one can help. It's too late." What's too late? What happened to you? But the shadow was already moving, walking back down the hallway toward the stairs. I followed, camera and flashlight in hand, but by the time I reached the staircase, there was no one there. The house had returned to its empty silence. I spent another hour documenting everything I could find, then locked the door behind me and drove home. That night, I developed the photographs I'd taken, played back the audio recordings. Everything was there, the furniture, the family photos, even Matthew's bedroom with its mysterious map. But when I tried to show the pictures to my deputy the next morning, he saw only empty rooms. When I played the recordings, he heard only silence and the sound of my own breathing. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "maybe you should talk to someone about this. Maybe Doc Henley could." I didn't let him finish. I knew what he was thinking, what anyone would think. The old sheriff was losing his mind, seeing things that weren't there, chasing ghosts and empty houses. But I also knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd experienced in that house on Elm Street. The truth was somewhere in the spaces between memory and forgetting, between what was real and what everyone agreed was real. And at the center of that truth was Matthew Hale, the boy who had been missing for 43 years but had never really left. That weekend, I drove to the county seat, spent 2 days in the archives looking for any record of the Hale family. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, anything that might prove they had existed, that they had lived in Millbrook, that Matthew had been real. I found nothing. No trace of the Hales in any official record. It was as if the family had been carefully erased from history, leaving behind only that single, impossible missing person report. But in the basement of the county courthouse, wedged behind a filing cabinet that hadn't been moved in decades, I found something else. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, filled with handwriting I recognized as Sheriff Coleman's. The journal was a record of cases Coleman had never officially reported, incidents he'd investigated but never filed, mysteries he'd encountered but never solved. The entries dated back to his first year as sheriff, chronicling a pattern of strange occurrences that spanned his entire career. Children who appeared in school photographs but weren't enrolled in classes. Families who neighbors swore lived next door but had no legal claim to their houses. Missing person reports that wrote themselves in the middle of the night, appearing on his desk in handwriting no one could identify. And throughout it all, references to the hungry thing in the park. Something Coleman believed was responsible for the disappearances, something that fed on memory itself. The final entry was dated October 14, 1971, the day before Matthew Hale was reported missing. "It's getting stronger. More children are slipping through the cracks, existing in the spaces where memory fails. Dorothy Hale came to see me today, though I've never heard of any Hales in Millbrook. She knows what's happening to the children, knows what's taking them. Tomorrow she'll report her grandson missing, and by the end of the week, no one will remember he ever existed. Just like all the others. I've tried to fight it, tried to document everything, but it's too powerful. It doesn't just take the children, it takes the memory of them, erases them from history itself. The only way to remember them is to become like them, to exist in the spaces between what is and what people remember. I won't let it take another child. Tomorrow I'm going to the park. I'm going to face whatever's down there, even if it means no one will remember I existed either." Coleman had died of a heart attack the next day, found slumped over his desk in the sheriff's office. The official cause of death was a massive coronary, brought on by stress and poor health. But now I wondered if he'd died trying to fight something that fed on memory itself, something that had been hunting children in Millbrook for longer than anyone could remember. Something that was still hunting them. I closed the journal, held it against my chest, and realized that I was now the only person in Millbrook who remembered Sheriff Coleman's private investigation. Just as I was the only person who remembered Matthew Hale. The pattern was clear. The thing in the park, whatever it was, didn't just hate children. It took the memory of them, erased them so completely that even their families forgot they'd ever existed. The only people who retained any memory were those who had been touched by the mystery itself, who had looked too deeply into the spaces where the missing children lived. People like Dorothy Hale, who had somehow retained enough memory of her grandson to file a missing person report, even though the rest of the town had forgotten he existed. People like Sheriff Coleman, who had spent years documenting the disappearances even as the town forgot they'd ever happened. And now, people like me. I drove back to Millbrook that evening, went straight to the town park. It was a small place, just a few acres of grass and trees surrounding a duck pond, with a playground on one side and a bandstand where the centennial celebration had been held in 1973. During the day, it was full of families and children, laughter, and the sound of running feet. But in the evening, as shadows lengthened and the air grew cool, it became something else entirely. I parked near the entrance, walked slowly toward the center of the park. The grass seemed to muffle sound here, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The trees stood too still, their branches reaching toward a sky that looked slightly wrong, too dark, too close, like a lid settling over a box. At the center of the park, near the old bandstand, I found what I was looking for. A depression in the ground, circular and perhaps 10 feet across, where the grass grew differently than anywhere else. It was lusher here, more vibrant, as if the soil was richer, more fertile. As if it had been fed by something other than rainwater and fallen leaves. I stood at the edge of the circle, looking down at that unnaturally green grass, and felt something watching me from below. Something old and patient and endlessly hungry, something that had been feeding on the children of Millbrook for decades, maybe centuries. "I know you're there," I said quietly. "I know what you've been doing." The grass rustled without any wind to move it. From somewhere beneath my feet came a sound like breathing, slow and deep and satisfied. "You can't have any more," I continued. "I won't let you take another child." The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was complete, absolute, as if the entire park had been drained of sound. Then, from the darkness beneath the bandstand came a voice that might have belonged to Matthew Hale. "You can't stop it, Sheriff. You can only join us." I turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. Only shadows and the suggestion of movement just beyond the reach of the streetlights. "Where are they?" I called. "Where are the children?" The voice came again, closer this time, as if the speaker was standing right beside me. "We're everywhere. We're in the spaces between memory and forgetting. We're in the photographs where no one sees us, in the conversations where no one hears us, in the lives where no one remembers us." "Matthew? We're the children who fell through the cracks, Sheriff. The ones who were too curious, too aware, too willing to look into dark places. We exist now only in the spaces where memory fails, and we're so very lonely." I felt tears on my cheeks, though I couldn't remember starting to cry. "How do I help you? How do I bring you back?" The silence stretched out again, and when the voice returned, it was fainter, more distant. "You can't bring us back. But you can remember us. You can be the one who doesn't forget." A hand touched my shoulder, small, cold, unmistakably the hand of a child. I turned, but there was no one there. Only empty air and the lingering sensation of contact. "Remember us," came the whisper, so soft I might have imagined it. "Please, just remember us." I stood in that park until dawn, surrounded by the presence of children who existed only in the spaces between memory and forgetting. I listened to their whispered stories, Their accounts of how they'd been drawn to investigate the dark places in Millbrook, how they'd discovered the thing that fed on memory itself, how they'd been consumed not just physically but historically, erased so completely that even their families forgot they'd ever lived. As the sun rose and the park returned to its daytime appearance, innocent, welcoming, perfect for families and children, I made a decision. I couldn't save the missing children, couldn't bring them back from the spaces where they now existed. But I could remember them. I could document their stories, preserve their names, ensure that somewhere, someone would always know they had lived. I could be the keeper of their memory. That was 15 years ago. Since then, I've documented every case I could find, every child who has slipped through the cracks of Millbrook's collective memory. I've filled filing cabinets with their stories, lined my office walls with their photographs, recorded their whispered voices on hundreds of hours of tape. The thing in the park still hunts. Still takes children who look too deeply into dark places, who ask too many questions, who refuse to accept the safe, sanitized version of reality that most people prefer. But now, when they disappear, when they're erased from memory and history, there's one person who remembers. There's one person who knows their names. Matthew Hale was 14 years old when he vanished on October 15, 1971. He had brown hair and blue eyes and wore a red flannel shirt. He lived with his grandmother Dorothy at 418 Elm Street, and he was afraid that something in the town was hunting children. He was right to be afraid. But he existed. They all existed. And as long as I'm here, as long as I can remember, they won't be forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, I still see him walking through town, a flash of red flannel at the corner of my vision, the sound of sneakers on pavement just behind me. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the others too, the children who have joined him in the spaces between memory and forgetting. They wave to me from empty houses, call my name from deserted streets, leave messages written in steam on my bathroom mirror. They want me to know they're still here, still aware, still hoping that someday someone will find a way to bring them home. I'm getting old now. My hands shake when I write. My memory isn't what it used to be, and I know that soon I'll have to pass this responsibility on to someone else. Someone who can see beyond the safe boundaries of accepted reality. Someone who isn't afraid to look into dark places and acknowledge what they find there. Someone who won't let them be forgotten. Because that's what this is really about, not solving mysteries or catching monsters, but remembering. Bearing witness. Ensuring that the children who fall through the cracks of reality aren't lost forever in the spaces where memory fails. His name was Matthew Hale. He existed. He mattered. And somewhere in the shadows between what is and what people remember, he's still waiting to come home. I've worked my share of graveyard calls, but this was the first time the dead looked like they tried to get out. The morning started ordinary enough. Tuesday, middle of October, 1987. I remember because the maples along Cemetery Road had just started their dying, bleeding red and orange against the sky the color of old pewter. Been sheriff of Millbrook for 23 years by then, seen enough to know that ordinary mornings in small towns are the kind that like to fool you. The call came in around 8:30. Mrs. Henley, voice shaking like autumn leaves, telling me someone had gone and torn up the Whitmore plot. Now, Millbrook Cemetery sits on the old part of town, where the foundations run deep and the houses lean in toward each other like gossiping old women. The cemetery itself predates the town by near a decade, which always struck me as peculiar. Most places, you build the town first, then worry about where to put the dead. Here, seemed like the dead came first. I drove out in my patrol car, windows down despite the chill. Something about that morning air tasted different. Metallic, like pennies left too long in a pocket. The cemetery gates stood open, though I couldn't recall them ever being closed in all my years. black iron, twisted into shapes that might have been flowers once, before time and weather worked their own kind of vandalism. Mrs. Henley waited by the entrance, clutching her sweater tight. She cleaned the cemetery twice a week, had for near 30 years. Good woman, quiet type, the kind who minded her own business and expected others to do the same. But that morning, her eyes held something I'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition of something she'd hoped never to see again. "Over there," she said, pointing toward the older section. "The Whitmore plot. Someone's done something terrible." The Whitmore plot sat beneath a gnarled oak that had to be older than the cemetery itself. Maybe older than the town. Its roots pushed up through the earth in thick, rope-like coils, creating natural barriers between the graves. As I walked closer, I could smell it. Not the usual cemetery smell of turned earth and old flowers. This was different. Wet copper and something else. Something that reminded me of my grandmother's root cellar, where she kept the potatoes through winter, and they'd sometimes rot in the dark, sweet and putrid at the same time. The grave had been torn open, all right. But not by any shovel I'd ever seen. The earth lay scattered in perfect circles around the hole, as if something had burst up from below with tremendous force. The headstone, a simple granite marker reading, "Jonathan Whitmore 1823 to 1847, stood untouched. But the coffin. Lord help me, I can still see that coffin. It sat exposed in the hole, maybe 6 feet down, the wood dark with age and moisture. The lid had been pried open, splinters of rotted pine scattered around it like broken bones. But what stopped me cold, what made my knees go soft and my breakfast turn to acid in my gut, was the handprint. A single bloody handprint on the inside of the coffin lid. Fresh blood. Still wet enough to catch the morning light and gleam like a ruby set in tarnished wood. Mrs. Henley came up beside me, breathing shallow and quick. "That wasn't there yesterday," she whispered. "I cleaned this whole section yesterday. Every headstone, every plot. That grave was sealed tight." I knelt down, careful not to disturb anything, though what exactly I was preserving for evidence, I couldn't say. The handprint was perfect, detailed down to the ridges and whorls of fingerprints. Adult-sized, maybe a man's hand. The blood had run down in thin streams, pooling in the grain of the wood. "Anyone been reported missing?" Mrs. Henley asked. I shook my head. Millbrook was the kind of town where people noticed when their neighbors didn't pick up their mail for 2 days running. Besides, the blood was too fresh, too bright. This had happened recently. Maybe in the night. I stood up, joints creaking, and looked around the cemetery. Nothing else disturbed. No other graves touched. Just this one, Jonathan Whitmore, who'd been dead and buried for 140 years. "Mrs. Henley," I said, "I need you to go home. Don't talk to anyone about this." "Not yet." She nodded, gathering her cleaning supplies with hands that shook like she had palsy. As she walked away, I noticed how she kept glancing back over her shoulder, like something might be following her. Can't say I blamed her. I spent the next hour walking the cemetery, looking for any sign of how someone might have done this. The gates showed no signs of forcing. The fence around the perimeter stood intact, though it was only 4 feet high and wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The earth around the grave wasn't just disturbed, it was arranged. Those perfect circles, like ripples in a pond when you drop a stone. And the coffin itself sat at an angle, tilted up toward the surface as if whatever had been inside had pushed its way out from below. I called the state police, though I knew what they'd say. Vandalism, probably kids, maybe someone with a grudge against the Whitmore family. But there were no Whitmores left in Millbrook. Hadn't been for 50 years or more. And what kind of vandal brings fresh blood to smear inside a coffin? While I waited for the state boys to arrive, I drove into town to ask some questions. Millbrook's main street stretches for maybe 6 blocks, lined with the kind of businesses that have been there so long they've become part of the landscape. Fletcher's Hardware, Martha's Diner, the post office that also serves as the town hall. Places where people gather to talk, to share news and rumors and the kind of stories that grow in the telling. But that morning, nobody wanted to talk. I started at Martha's, where the coffee's strong enough to wake the dead and the gossip flows like water downhill. Usually, any unusual activity in town would be dissected, analyzed, and theorized about before I could finish my first cup. But when I mentioned the cemetery, conversation stopped. Eyes found other places to look. Forks moved food around plates without taking bites. Old Pete Carpenter, who'd been coming to Martha's every morning for 20 years, suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Sarah Mills, the postmaster, claimed she hadn't heard anything unusual during the night, though she lived close enough to the cemetery to hear a cat walking on the headstones. It was at Fletcher's Hardware that I got my first real answer, though it wasn't the one I wanted. Tom Fletcher, third generation to run the store, was arranging shovels when I walked in. He looked up, saw my expression, and his face went pale as paper. "It's about the cemetery, isn't it?" he said. I nodded. "Someone dug up the Whitmore grave. Thought you might have seen something, heard something." Tom set down the shovel he'd been holding, careful-like, as if it might bite him. "Sheriff, I'd been in this town all my life. My daddy before me, and his daddy before him. There's things about Millbrook that don't get talked about much. Things that maybe should stay buried." "What kind of things?" He glanced around the store, though we were alone. "The Whitmore place. You know it?" I did. Old house on the outskirts of town, been empty for decades. 2 stories, white clapboard gone gray with weather, windows boarded up like dead eyes. Kids said it was haunted, but kids say that about every empty house. "Jonathan Whitmore built that house in 1823, Tom continued. "Same year he came to town. Nobody knew where he came from, but he had money. Good money. Bought land, built the house, started courting the prettiest girl in town. What happened to him?" Tom's hands worked at a rag, cleaning tools that were already clean. "Died young. 24 years old. But the way he died, that's what folks don't like to talk about." I waited. In small towns, patience is usually rewarded. "They found him in his house, Sheriff. Locked from the inside. No sign of violence, no sign of illness. Just dead, sitting in his chair like he'd fallen asleep. But his hands—" Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "His hands were torn up something fierce. Fingernails gone, fingers bloody down to the bone. Like he'd been trying to claw his way out of something." The metallic taste in my mouth got stronger. Doc back then said his heart just stopped. Young man, healthy as a horse, heart just stopped beating. But the old-timers, they had other ideas. Said Jonathan Whitmore had made a deal with something that came to collect. "What kind of deal?" Tom shrugged, but his eyes held the weight of stories passed down through generations. "The kind where you get what you want, but you pay for it later." I left Fletcher's with more questions than answers and a growing unease that had nothing to do with the October chill. The state police arrived around noon, took their pictures, made their reports, and reached the same conclusion I'd expected. Vandalism, probably drug-related. They'd look into it and file their paperwork. But they didn't see what I saw in that handprint. The desperation. The fresh blood that had no business being fresh. I spent the afternoon driving around town, talking to people, getting the same careful non-answers. It was like the whole town had agreed not to know anything, not to see anything, not to remember anything that might be important. As evening approached, I found myself back at the cemetery. The state boys had filled in the grave, covered it with a tarp, and marked it off with yellow tape. Official. Temporary. But standing there in the gathering dusk, I knew this wasn't over. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and my breath came out in small white puffs. The oak tree above the Whitmore grave creaked in the wind, its branches scraping against each other with a sound like fingernails on wood. That's when I heard it. Scratching. Faint at first, almost lost in the wind. But persistent. Rhythmic. Like someone tapping Morse code with their fingernails. I followed the sound, walking slowly between the headstones, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The scratching grew louder as I approached the Whitmore plot. But it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from the oak tree. I shined my light up into the branches and felt my blood turn to ice water. There were scratches in the bark. Fresh scratches, carved deep enough to show the white wood underneath. They formed letters, crude but readable. "Let me out." The scratching stopped. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, flashlight trained on those letters, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, I walked back to my car, drove home, and poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon before I called it a day. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that handprint. Every creak of my old house settling sounded like scratching. And when I finally did drift off, I dreamed of Jonathan Whitmore, sitting in his chair, clawing at the arms until his fingers bled, trying to escape something that had no door. The next morning brought more problems. Mrs. Patterson called around 7, voice high and tight with panic. Her cat, Whiskers, had been missing for 2 days. Not unusual for a cat, except Whiskers was 15 years old and hadn't left the porch in 3 years. She'd found him that morning, sitting on Jonathan Whitmore's headstone, perfectly still. "He won't move, Sheriff," she said. "Won't eat, won't drink. Just sits there staring at that grave like he's waiting for something." I drove out to find Mrs. Patterson standing at the cemetery gates, afraid to go in. Whiskers sat on the Whitmore headstone exactly as she'd described, orange tabby gone gray with age, green eyes fixed on the disturbed earth below. I approached slowly, the way you approach any wild thing. But Whiskers didn't acknowledge me. Didn't move when I picked him up, didn't protest when I handed him to Mrs. Patterson. He felt wrong in my hands. Too light, like he was mostly air inside his fur. "Take him to Doc Morrison," I told her. "Have him looked at." She nodded and hurried away, but I could see in her eyes that she knew what I knew. Whatever was wrong with Whiskers couldn't be fixed by any veterinarian. I spent that day making calls, trying to find information about Jonathan Whitmore. The county records office had birth and death certificates, property deeds, the usual paper trail of a man's life. But the details Tom Fletcher had mentioned weren't in any official records. It was the town librarian, Miss Chin, who finally gave me what I needed. She'd been keeping the local history collection for 40 years, including newspapers, diaries, and letters that never made it into official records. "There was talk," she said, pulling out a folder thick with yellowed papers. "Rumors and superstitions, mostly. But some of the old families kept records of their own." She showed me a diary entry from 1847, written by a woman named Elizabeth Crane. "Jonathan Whitmore died today. Found him in his house this morning when he failed to appear for our engagement. Such a terrible sight. His hands were bloodied as if he had fought some terrible battle, but there was no one else in the house. The doors were barred from within. Dr. Henderson says his heart simply stopped, but I know better. Jonathan spoke to me before of dreams, of something that called to him in the night. He said he had made promises that he could not keep, bargains that demanded more than he was willing to pay. I fear he has paid the ultimate price for his desires. Another entry, dated 3 days later. Strange happenings since Jonathan's burial. Animals will not go near his grave. The oak tree above his plot has begun to wither, though it is only spring. Last night, I swear I heard scratching coming from the cemetery, as if something buried wishes to return to the world above. I copied the entries and drove back to the cemetery as the sun set. The yellow tape had been removed, the grave filled and covered with fresh sod. But the oak tree was dying. Its leaves, which had been turning their normal autumn colors just 2 days ago, now hung black and brittle from the branches. The bark had begun to split and peel, revealing what underneath that looked diseased, almost gangrenous. And the scratching had spread. Not just, "Let me out," anymore. Now there were more words, carved into every surface of the trunk I could see. "Help me." "So cold." "Promise." "Deceived." I stood there until full dark, watching and listening. Around midnight I heard it again. The scratching. But this time, I could tell it wasn't coming from the tree. It was coming from underground. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the freshly sodded earth of the Whitmore grave. The scratching was rhythmic, desperate. Like someone trying to claw their way through wood and dirt and time itself. That's when I understood. Jonathan Whitmore wasn't trying to get out because he was alive. He was trying to get out because something else wanted in. I spent the rest of that night in my patrol car, parked outside the cemetery gates, watching and waiting. Nothing happened that I could see. But as dawn approached, the scratching stopped. And in the growing light, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. The fresh sod on the Whitmore grave had been disturbed again. Not torn up like before, but pushed up from below. Like something underneath was slowly, steadily pressing upward. I called the state police again, demanded they dig up the grave, insisted something was wrong. They sent the same 2 officers as before, and after an hour of my explanations and their skeptical looks, they agreed to a second excavation. What we found shouldn't have been possible. The coffin was empty. Completely, impossibly empty. But the handprint was still there on the inside of the lid, and now there were more. Dozens of bloody handprints covering every inch of the coffin's interior. Some were the same size as the first, but others were smaller. Child-sized. And carved into the bottom of the coffin, in letters deep enough to splinter the old wood. "The door is opening." The state officers had no explanation. Neither did I. But as we stood there looking into that empty coffin, I felt something I never experienced in 23 years of law enforcement. Pure, primal terror. Not the fear of violence or criminals or any human threat. This was older, deeper. The kind of fear that lives in the darkest corners of human consciousness. The ancestral memory of things that hunt in the spaces between reality and nightmare. We filled the grave again, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was happening had moved beyond vandalism, beyond explanation, beyond the reach of normal law enforcement. That evening, I drove out to the old Whitmore place. The house sat on 5 acres of overgrown land, surrounded by maples and oaks that had grown wild and tall. The driveway was barely visible beneath years of fallen leaves. Windows boarded up, porch sagging, roof missing shingles like broken teeth. But there was a light in the upper window. Impossible, of course. The house had been without power for decades. But there it was, a soft yellow glow that flickered like candlelight. I sat in my car for maybe 20 minutes, working up the courage to approach. Everything in my body told me to drive away, to leave this place and never come back. But I was the sheriff. People depended on me to face the things they couldn't face themselves. The front door was locked, but the wood around the frame had rotted enough that a good push opened it anyway. The smell hit me immediately. Not decay or mildew, but something else. Something that reminded me of copper pennies and root cellars and things that had been buried too long. The inside of the house was in better condition than the exterior suggested. Dust covered everything, but the furniture remained. Heavy wooden pieces, handcrafted and built to last. In the front room, facing the boarded windows, sat a high-backed chair. There were scratches in the arms. Deep gouges where fingernails had clawed at the wood. The light was coming from upstairs. I climbed the steps, each one creaking under my weight, my flashlight throwing strange shadows on the wallpapered walls. The upper hallway had 3 doors, all closed. The light came from under the middle door. Inside I found a bedroom. Simple furniture, a bed with a quilt that looked like it had been made yesterday. And on the bedside table, a candle burned with that soft yellow flame I'd seen from outside. Next to the candle was a leather-bound journal, open to a page covered in handwriting. The ink looked fresh. I read the entry by candlelight. I have made a terrible mistake. The thing I summoned promised me wealth, love, success in all my endeavors. It asked only for a small payment, to be collected at a later date. I was young and foolish and eager for the life I felt I deserved. But the payment was not what I expected. It wanted me to serve as a door, a gateway between its realm and ours. And when I refused, when I tried to break our bargain, it took me anyway. It buried me alive, Sheriff, trapped me in a box in the ground where I have scratched and clawed for 140 years. But the door is weakening. Every Halloween, when the veil between worlds grows thin, I feel it trying to push through. And each year, it gets closer to breaking free entirely. I try to warn people. I try to leave signs. But no one listens to the dead, Sheriff. No one wants to believe that some bargains can never be broken. It will come tomorrow night. Halloween. And when it does, it will use my grave as a doorway. All those years of my imprisonment have worn the boundaries thin. It will step through, into our world, and it will collect what it believes it is owed. Not just from me, Sheriff. From everyone in Millbrook. Everyone who has ever lived on land that was once mine, everyone who has ever walked past my grave, everyone who has ever spoken my name. It will collect the entire town. I dropped the journal, and the candle flame flickered as if disturbed by a sudden wind. But there was no wind in that sealed room. You came, said a voice behind me. I turned, and Jonathan Whitmore stood in the doorway. He looked exactly as he must have in life. Young, maybe mid-20s, dressed in the simple clothes of a frontier settler. But his hands were torn and bloody, fingernails gone, fingers worn down to bone in places. I've been trying to warn you, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a century and a half of desperation. Every way I could think of. The scratches, the handprints, the messages in the tree. But you had to come here, to the source, before you could see me. What do you want? I managed to ask. I want to stop it, he said. The thing I summoned, the thing I made a bargain with. It's been using my grave as an anchor point, weakening the barrier between worlds. Tomorrow night, on Halloween, that barrier will collapse entirely. What kind of thing? Jonathan's bloody hands clenched into fists. Something old. Something that feeds on human suffering and despair. It promised me everything I wanted, but the price was to become its servant, its doorway into this world. How do we stop it? There's only one way, he said. The bargain has to be completed or broken entirely. Either I have to fulfill my end of the agreement and become its permanent gateway, or what? Or someone else has to take my place. The candle flame guttered and went out, plunging us into darkness. When I managed to get my flashlight working again, Jonathan was gone. But his words hung in the air like smoke. I drove home that night with my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. At home, I poured myself a drink, then another, then a third. But the bourbon couldn't wash away what I'd seen, what I'd learned. The entire town was in danger, and I was the only one who knew it. Halloween arrived gray and cold, with a sky that looked like old pewter and air that tasted of metal and grave dirt. I spent the day trying to convince myself I'd imagined everything, that stress and too little sleep had finally caught up with me. But as evening approached, I found myself back at the cemetery. I wasn't alone. Mrs. Henley was there, standing by the gates with a small group of other townspeople. Tom Fletcher, Miss Chin, Doc Morrison, maybe a dozen others. They all looked at me with the same expression, the weight of knowledge they'd carried for years and hoped never to use. "You know," I said. It wasn't a question. Tom Fletcher nodded. "We all know, Sheriff. Our families have known for generations. Some secrets are too dangerous to share, but too important to forget." "Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed us?" Miss Chin asked. "Before you saw it yourself, would you have believed any of it?" She was right. I wouldn't have. "Every Halloween, it tries to break through," Doc Morrison said. "Every year, we come here to make sure it doesn't succeed. Our fathers did it, and their fathers before them. It's been our responsibility since Jonathan Whitmore died." "What do you do?" "We watch," Mrs. Henley said simply. "We bear witness. And if necessary—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. If necessary, they were prepared to make sure the door stayed closed. By any means necessary. We entered the cemetery together as the last light faded from the sky. The Whitmore grave looked different in the darkness. The sod had been pushed up further, creating a small mound. The oak tree was completely dead now, its branches brittle and black against the stars. At midnight it began. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe. And from the Whitmore grave came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not scratching this time. Something deeper, more fundamental. Like the earth itself was groaning under tremendous pressure. The mound of disturbed sod began to glow with a sickly green light. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, growing brighter with each pulse. "It's starting," Tom Fletcher whispered. The ground around the grave began to crack. Not just hairline fractures, but deep fissures that spread outward in perfect geometric patterns. And from those cracks came whispers. Hundreds of voices speaking words and languages I didn't recognize. The green light intensified, and I could see shapes moving within it. Shadows that didn't correspond to any earthly form, writhing and reaching toward the surface. "Sheriff," Miss Chin said urgently, "you have to choose. Now." "Choose what?" "Someone has to complete the bargain," she said. "Someone has to take Jonathan's place and seal the door permanently. Or that thing breaks through, and everyone in Millbrook pays the price." The cracks in the earth widened. The whispers became screams. And through the green light, I could see something massive pushing upward, something with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. I thought about my life. 23 years as sheriff of a small town where nothing ever happened. No wife, no children, no legacy except the cases I'd solved and the peace I'd kept. Maybe it was enough. Maybe it was time to pay a different kind of debt. I started walking toward the grave. "Sheriff, no!" Mrs. Henley called out. But I kept walking. The green light washed over me, and I felt the weight of a century and a half of accumulated malevolence pressing down like a physical force. The thing in the grave sensed me approaching, and its screams of rage turned to sounds of anticipation. I reached the edge of the cracks and looked down. It was beautiful and terrible, that thing from beyond the boundaries of our world. Beautiful like a wildfire or a tornado, destructive forces of nature that inspire awe even as they bring devastation. But there was intelligence in those burning eyes, ancient and patient and utterly without mercy. "I'll make the trade," I said. The screaming stopped. The earth went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Jonathan Whitmore stepped out of the green light. He looked different now. Whole. His hands were healed, his clothes clean and new. He looked like a man at peace for the first time in more than a century. "Thank you," he said. "But it's not your bargain to keep." He reached out and touched my shoulder, and I felt a warmth spread through my body like sunlight after a long winter. "I made this deal," he said. "I opened this door, and I'm the one who has to close it." He turned toward the grave, toward the thing that writhed and raged in the green light. "I fulfill my part of the bargain," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery like a bell. "I become your servant, your gateway, your anchor in this world. But only for me. Only for the one who made the deal. Everyone else in this town is free." The thing's screams shook the ground, rattled the windows of houses half a mile away. But it was bound by rules older than civilization, laws that governed the making and keeping of supernatural bargains. It had to accept. Jonathan looked back at me one last time. "Tell them I tried to make it right," he said. Then he stepped into the green light and was gone. The earth collapsed back into itself with a sound like thunder. The green light faded. The whispers stopped. And when the dust settled, the Whitmore grave looked exactly as it had before any of this began. Except for one thing. The oak tree, dead and brittle just moments before, began to put out new leaves. Green and fresh and alive, despite the October chill. We filled in the cracks as best we could, reset the headstone, and went home. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson called to tell me that Whiskers was back to his old self, demanding breakfast and complaining about the weather. That was 37 years ago. I retired from the sheriff's department in 1995, passed the badge to a younger man who doesn't know the full history of this town. Maybe it's better that way. Some knowledge is too heavy for one person to carry alone. I still visit the cemetery sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the sun slants through the trees just right. The Whitmore grave is peaceful now, covered with grass and wild flowers that grow nowhere else in the cemetery. The oak tree is magnificent, easily the largest and healthiest tree for miles around. And sometimes, when the light hits it just right, you can see carved into the bark, grown over now but still visible if you know where to look. At peace. I've never told this story before. Never wrote it down, never spoke of it except in fragments to the others who were there that night. But we're all getting old now, and when we're gone, someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember. Because there are other graves in Millbrook Cemetery. Other headstones with dates that don't quite match the records. Other trees that grow in patterns that don't make sense. And every Halloween, just to be safe, I still drive out there as the sun sets. I park by the gates and keep watch, the way Tom Fletcher and Miss Chin and Mrs. Henley taught me to do. Because some doors, once opened, never fully close. And some bargains echo through generations, waiting for the right moment, the right weakness, the right fool willing to trade everything for a taste of what they think they deserve. The dead stay quiet in Millbrook, most nights. But I'll keep watching, just in case. After all, I've worked my share of graveyard calls. And I know how to tell when the dead look like they're trying to get out. We call him the Looker. And if you catch his eyes, you'll be gone by dawn. That's what my grandmother used to say, back when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and this badge was still a gleam in my daddy's eye. Course, back then I thought it was just another one of her stories. like the one about the woman in white who walked the cemetery on moonless nights, or the tale of old Jeremiah Coote who supposedly still tended his tobacco fields 30 years after they buried him. Small towns breed such stories like stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 43 years now, and I can tell you that most of those old tales are just that, tales. Folks get bored, they get scared of the dark, they see shadows where there ain't nothing but branches swaying in the wind. But the looker, well, that's different. That one's real. Real as the scars on my hands and the gray in what's left of my hair. It started in earnest during the autumn of '97, though looking back now, I reckon the signs were there long before. Little things, you understand? The kind of details that don't mean much on their own but start to paint a picture when you step back far enough to see the whole canvas. Mrs. Henderson, who lived alone in that yellow house at the end of Maple Street, started keeping her curtains drawn tight during the day. When I asked her about it during one of my regular check-ins, she just shook her head and muttered something about eyes in the trees. I figured it was her age talking. She was pushing 85 and had been getting more peculiar by the month. Then there was the Jameson boy, barely 16 and full of that special kind of stupidity that comes with youth and too much free time. He'd taken to driving his daddy's truck out to the edge of town most evenings, parking right where the pavement gave way to gravel and the gravel gave way to nothing but forest. Said he was looking for something. When pressed, he couldn't rightly explain what that something was. The phone calls to the station increased too, though most folks hung up before saying much of anything. My deputy, Carl, good man, been with the department since before his voice changed. He started keeping a tally. 3, 4 calls a night, sometimes more. Silence on the other end, then a quiet click. The caller ID usually showed numbers from right here in town, but when we'd call back, folks claimed they'd been asleep for hours. October arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt wrong somehow, like nature itself was holding its breath. The leaves should have been turning, should have been drifting down in those lazy spirals that make autumn such a fine time of year. Instead, they hung on the branches, green as summer but somehow brittle. When the wind caught them, they made sounds like whispers, like secrets being shared between the maples and the oaks. That's when Martha Colby came to see me. Martha ran the diner on Main Street, had been serving coffee and pie to this town for longer than most of us had been drawing breath. She was the kind of woman who knew everybody's business but kept it to herself, the kind you could trust with your worst troubles and your darkest fears. So when she walked into my office that Tuesday morning, her face pale as milk and her hands shaking like autumn leaves, I knew something was wrong. Really wrong. "Sheriff," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk without invitation. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without thinking I've lost my mind." I poured her coffee from the pot Carl kept brewing all day, black as night and strong enough to wake the dead. She wrapped her fingers around the mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "Last night," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was closing up the diner. You know how I always stay late on Mondays, getting ready for the week ahead? Well, I was wiping down the counter when I got that feeling. You know the one, like someone's watching you. I knew the feeling well enough. 43 years of law enforcement teaches you to pay attention to such things. I looked up," Martha continued, "and there he was, standing at the edge of the parking lot, right where the streetlight peters out into darkness. Tall man, taller than anyone I know in town. Just standing there, still as stone, looking right at me through the window. Could you make out his face?" Martha shook her head, but not in the way folks do when they mean no. She shook it like she was trying to dislodge something unpleasant from her memory. "That's the thing, Sheriff. I couldn't see his face proper, on account of the distance and the darkness. But his eyes—" She paused, took a sip of coffee with hands that trembled just enough to rattle the cup against the saucer. His eyes were black. Not brown, not dark, black. Like looking into empty holes. I'd heard similar descriptions before, whispered in the grocery store aisles and murmured over drinks at Henley's Tavern. Always the same details, tall, silent black eyes. Standing at the tree line, watching. How long did he stand there? Long enough for me to finish cleaning, count the register, and lock up. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, he was gone. But Sheriff. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. When I got to my car, I could smell something strange. Sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. And there were footprints in the gravel where he'd been standing. Big ones, size 13 at least. But they just stopped. Right there in the middle of the lot, like he'd just vanished into thin air. After Martha left, I sat in my office for a long while, staring out the window at the street beyond. Millbrook had always been a quiet town, the kind of place where the biggest excitement usually involved teenagers tipping cows or old-timers getting too deep into their cups at the annual Harvest Festival. We'd had our share of troubles over the years. Domestic disputes, the occasional break-in, that unfortunate business with the Peterson boy and his daddy's shotgun back in '83. But nothing like this. Nothing that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up and stay up. I decided to do some checking around. The Historical Society occupied a narrow building on Church Street, wedged between Murphy's Hardware and what used to be Sinclair's Five and Dime. Mrs. Ethel Pritchard had been the Society's president, secretary, treasurer, and only active member for the better part of 20 years. If anyone knew the old stories, the real stories, it would be her. I found her in the back room, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with yellowing newspapers, faded photographs, and documents that looked like they'd been rescued from someone's attic at the last possible moment. The air smelled of dust and old paper and something else, something floral and cloying that made my stomach turn just a little. "Sheriff," she said, looking up from a stack of church records that appeared to date back to the 1800s. "What brings you to our little museum of forgotten things?" "Research," I said, settling into a chair that creaked ominously under my weight. "I'm looking for information about local legends, old stories. Particularly anything about someone called the Looker." The change in Mrs. Pritchard was immediate and unsettling. Her pleasant smile faded, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. She set down the records she'd been examining and folded her hands in her lap. "Why would you be asking about that?" "Police business." "Have you heard the name before?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Finally, she rose from her chair and walked to one of the filing cabinets that lined the far wall. After some searching, she withdrew a manila folder that looked like it had been handled frequently over the years. "Sit down, Sheriff. This might take a while." The folder contained newspaper clippings, some dating back to the 1920s, along with handwritten accounts, and what appeared to be official police reports. As Mrs. Pritchard spread them across the table, a pattern began to emerge. 1923, 3 children disappeared from their beds on consecutive nights. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle. The only common element was that each child had been heard talking to someone outside their bedroom window in the hours before they vanished. 1937, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell claimed to have seen a tall figure watching her family's farm from the tree line. 2 weeks later, her infant son was found missing from his crib. The child was never recovered. 1951, multiple witnesses reported seeing a man standing motionless at various locations around town's perimeter. Always tall, always silent, always watching. The sightings stopped abruptly after the Hendricks family, husband, wife, and teenage daughter, disappeared from their home during the night. Their car was still in the driveway. Their beds appeared to have been slept in, but they were simply gone. 1969. Similar reports, similar disappearances. This time it was an elderly couple named Ashworth. The pattern, Mrs. Pritchard said quietly, is always the same. The sightings begin in autumn, usually October. People start reporting the figure in the trees, watching. Then, one by one, folks begin to disappear. Never any trace, never any explanation. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stops. Sometimes for 10 years, sometimes for 20. But it always comes back. I studied the documents, noting the dates, the descriptions, the eerily consistent details. Always tall. Always silent. Always watching from the tree line with those impossible black eyes. Mrs. Pritchard, I said finally, what do you think we're dealing with here? She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. My grandmother told me stories, she said. Stories her grandmother told her. About something that lived in the deep woods, something that wasn't quite human but wasn't quite animal either. Something that fed on attention. On being seen. The more people noticed it, the stronger it became. And when it was strong enough, she gestured at the newspaper clippings. People started disappearing. The rest of October passed like a fever dream. Reports of the figure increased nightly. Always the same description, always at the tree line, always watching. I organized patrols, had Carl and me take turns driving the perimeter roads after dark. But we never saw anything more than shadows and the occasional deer. But others did. Tommy Wickham, who delivered newspapers before dawn, swore he saw the figure standing beside the old elm on Cottage Street. Said the thing turned its head to watch him pass, smooth as oil, never blinking. The Morrison twins, aged 12 and stupid with curiosity, claimed they tried to get closer to the figure one evening. Got within 50 yards, they said, before the smell stopped them. Sweet and rotten, like funeral flowers left in the sun too long. Old Pete Gardner, who'd been the town drunk for as long as anyone could remember, sobered up overnight. Came to the station 3 days running, begging us to lock him up, keep him safe. Said he'd seen the black eyes in his dreams, staring through the walls of his shack by the river. And then there was the Jameson boy. I found him on Halloween morning, sitting in his daddy's truck at the edge of town, staring into the woods with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. The engine was running, had been running all night according to the gas gauge, but the boy himself was still as death. Son, I said, tapping on the driver's side window. You all right? He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his face that made my blood run cold. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of hollowed-out emptiness, like someone had scooped out everything that made him human and left only the shell behind. He's beautiful, the boy whispered. Standing right there in the trees. Been there all night, just watching me. Just waiting. I looked where he was pointing, scanned the tree line carefully, but saw nothing but maple and oak and the tangled undergrowth of late autumn. But the boy kept staring, kept smiling that empty smile, and I realized with growing horror that he was seeing something I couldn't. We took him to the county hospital, had the doctors run every test they could think of. Physically, he was fine. Mentally, well, that was another story. He sat in his room, staring out the window toward the woods, talking to someone who wasn't there. The nurses said he barely slept, barely ate. Just watched and whispered and smiled that terrible empty smile. 3 days later he was gone. Not missing, gone. The bed was still warm, the sheets barely disturbed, but the boy had simply vanished like smoke in the wind. The hospital was 3 stories up, the windows didn't open, and the only door was monitored around the clock. but he was gone just the same. That's when I decided to go into the woods myself. November 1st dawned gray and cold, the kind of day that makes you want to stay inside with hot coffee and a good book. But I'd made up my mind, and 43 years of wearing this badge had taught me that sometimes you have to face the things that scare you most. I went alone, despite Carl's protests. If something happened to me, I told him, at least the town would still have a lawman. Truth was, I didn't want anyone else to see what I might find out there. Some knowledge is too heavy to share. The woods beyond Millbrook stretched for miles in every direction, thick with old growth and the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like cotton. I followed the deer paths at first, then struck out on my own when they petered out into nothing but trackless undergrowth. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I smelled it. Sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a closed room. The same smell Martha had described, the same smell the Morrison twins had mentioned. It grew stronger as I pushed deeper into the woods, until it was so thick I could taste it on my tongue. That's when I found the clearing. It was perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and nothing grew there. Not grass, not weeds, not even moss. Just bare earth, packed down hard as concrete and black as sin. In the center of the clearing stood a single oak tree, ancient and massive, its branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. And hanging from one of those branches, swaying gently in the breeze, was a child's shoe. Then another. And another. Dozens of them, scattered among the branches like grotesque Christmas ornaments. Shoes of all sizes, all ages, some so old they were little more than leather scraps held together by memory. I recognized the Jameson boys' sneakers, bright white and barely worn. Below them hung a pair of tiny slippers that might have belonged to Sarah Mitchell's infant son, though after 60 years it was impossible to be sure. I was so focused on the horrible sight above me that I almost missed the sound behind me. Almost. The soft rustle of leaves, the whisper of footsteps on dead ground. I turned slowly, my hand instinctively moving to the service weapon at my hip, and found myself face to face with the looker. He was tall, just as everyone had said. 7 feet at least, maybe more, with long limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. His skin was pale as winter moonlight, and stretched tight over bones that looked sharp enough to cut. But it was his eyes that held me frozen in place, perfect circles of absolute blackness that reflected nothing, absorbed everything, and seemed to go down forever. We stood there for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Just watched me with those impossible eyes while the sweet smell of decay grew stronger, and the child's shoes swayed gently overhead. When he finally spoke, his voice was like wine through dry leaves, like whispers in an empty house, like the sound loneliness makes when it thinks no one is listening. "You see me," he said, and it wasn't a question. I tried to answer, tried to speak, but my throat had closed up tight as a fist. All I could do was nod. "Good," he whispered, and smiled with too many teeth. "I was getting hungry." That's when I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth like a madman, branches tearing at my clothes and face, roots catching at my feet. Behind me, I could hear laughter, soft and melodious and completely insane. But I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. Because I knew, with the certainty that comes from 43 years of seeing the worst humanity has to offer, that if I turned around and looked into those black eyes again, I'd never make it home. I burst out of the woods as the sun was setting, my uniform torn and muddy, my hands scraped raw from a dozen falls. Carl found me there at the tree line, sitting in my patrol car with the engine running and the doors locked, staring at nothing. "Sheriff?" he said, tapping on the window. "Sheriff, you all right?" I wasn't all right. Haven't been all right since. But I rolled down the window anyway and told him we needed to leave. Needed to get as far from those woods as possible before full dark settled over the town. The disappearances stopped after that night. The sightings too. For 3 years, Millbrook was quiet as the grave, and I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whatever I'd disturbed in that clearing had moved on to some other town, some other group of people to watch and wait, and eventually take. I was wrong. The Jameson boy came back on a Tuesday in March, walking out of the woods like he just stepped out for a smoke. He hadn't aged a day, still looked 16, still wore the same clothes he'd disappeared in. But his eyes were black now. Black as midnight, black as the space between stars, black as the thing that had taken him. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge anyone who tried to talk to him. Just walked through town with that same empty smile, heading for the tree line. I followed him, of course. Followed him right to the edge of the woods, where he stopped and turned to look at me with those horrible dark eyes. "He's waiting," the boy said in a voice like autumn wind. "He's always waiting. And he remembers you, Sheriff. Remembers how you looked at him, how you saw him. He's been dreaming about you." Then he walked into the woods and vanished among the trees. That was 15 years ago, and I haven't seen the looker since. But I know he's out there, somewhere in the deep places where the light doesn't reach. Waiting. Watching. Getting stronger every time someone catches a glimpse of him from the corner of their eye. Every time someone whispers his name in the dark. The town's forgotten him, mostly. New people have moved in, people who don't know the old stories, don't understand the rules. They think the woods are just woods, that shadows are just shadows. They'll learn different, given time. Because he's patient, the looker. Patient as stone, patient as death. He can wait decades, centuries if need be. Time doesn't mean much to something like him. But eventually, when the moment is right, when the hunger gets too strong to ignore, he'll come back. And when he does, God help us all. I'm retiring next month, turning this badge over to someone younger, someone who might be able to handle what's coming. Carl thinks I'm getting soft, getting old. Maybe I am. But I know something he doesn't, something I pray he never has to learn. I've seen what waits in the woods. I've looked into those black eyes and felt the hunger there, cold and patient and utterly inhuman. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees and the shadows seem to move on their own, I catch a glimpse of something tall and still at the edge of my vision. Watching. Always watching. We call him the looker. And if you catch his eyes, you'll be gone by dawn. That's what my grandmother used to say, and God forgive me, she was right. It started with static. Then a voice crackled through the old receiver, describing a murder I hadn't even found yet. Been 43 years since I hung up this badge, but that transmission still plays in my head some nights when the wind picks up just right through the pines. Millbrook County never was much to look at, just another forgotten pocket of America where the roads peter out into gravel and the cell towers don't reach. Population 2,847 according to the last census, though I suspect that number's been dropping steady since the mill closed. The radio in question was an old Motorola unit we'd inherited from the Sheriff's Department 2 counties over when they upgraded their equipment in '98. Dispatcher's console, model MT500, built like a tank and twice as reliable as anything they make nowadays. Thing had been crackling with the usual chatter that Tuesday morning. Livestock complaints, a fender bender out by the Lutheran church, Mrs. Henderson reporting her neighbor's dog again. Then the static hit. Not the usual kind you get when atmospheric pressure shifts or some trucker's CB bleeds through. This was different. Deeper. Like something clawing its way up from the bottom of a well. I was nursing my third cup of coffee, trying to make sense of the Morrison Farm incident report, when Deputy Walsh looked up from her paperwork with that expression people get when they're not quite sure they heard what they thought they heard. "Sheriff," she said, voice careful. "You catching this?" The voice that emerged from the speaker wasn't one I recognized, though in a county this size, I knew pretty much everyone by their voice alone. Male, middle-aged maybe, with the flat vowels you get from living too long in cold places. But it was what he was saying that made my coffee go cold in my cup. "Bodies in the basement of the old Kellerman place. Been there 3 days now. Blunt force trauma to the skull, probably a tire iron. Blood spatter on the north wall suggests the perpetrator was left-handed." Walsh and I locked eyes across the small office. The Kellerman place had been empty for near on 15 years, ever since old Henrik passed and his kids moved down to Florida. Boarded up tight, with county liens stacked against it like cordwood. "Unknown caller, please identify yourself." Walsh spoke into her headset. Nothing but that deep static, like radio waves traveling through mud. "Victim's name is Thomas Eugene Crawford. Age 47. Drives a blue 2003 Ford pickup with Missouri plates." The voice continued, mechanical and precise. "Been looking for work since the mine closures up north." I'd never heard of any Thomas Eugene Crawford, but something about the specificity of it made my spine prickle. In 3 decades of law enforcement, you develop a sense for truth, even when it comes wrapped in impossibility. "Walsh, get on the horn to dispatch in Jefferson City. Run that name and those plates." I stood, already reaching for my hat. "I'm going to take a ride out to the Kellerman place." The road to the old Kellerman homestead hadn't been properly maintained since the county budget cuts of '02. My cruiser bounced through potholes deep enough to lose a small child in, past the rusted-out water tower that hadn't held water since the Carter administration. Everything out here had the look of a place the world had decided to forget. Sagging fence posts, mailboxes shot full of holes, abandoned cars slowly being digested by honeysuckle and Virginia creeper. The Kellerman house sat at the end of a quarter-mile dirt drive, surrounded by oak trees old enough to remember when this was still Cherokee land. 2-story farmhouse, white paint peeling like sunburned skin, front porch sagging under the weight of too many harsh winters. The boards across the windows looked solid enough, but someone had pried loose the plywood covering the basement door around back. I called it in before I went down those stairs. Protocol, even when protocol doesn't account for voices from nowhere describing crimes that might not exist. The basement smelled like damp concrete and something else, something sweet and wrong that made my sinuses burn. My flashlight beam swept across moldy cardboard boxes, a rusted-out washer, and there, Thomas Eugene Crawford lay crumpled against the north wall, exactly where the voice had said he'd be. Blue work shirt, faded jeans, boots that had seen better decades. The back of his skull looked like someone had taken a tire iron to it, and the blood spatter on the concrete behind him painted a picture any forensics textbook would recognize. But here's the thing that still keeps me up some nights. The blood was dry. Completely dry. That voice on the radio had been right about the 3 days. State police took over the scene within 6 hours, which was fine by me. I'd worked plenty of homicides in my time, but never one that had been called in before it was discovered. The coroner confirmed what we already knew, blunt force trauma, probably a tire iron or similar implement. Victim had been dead approximately 72 hours. Thomas Eugene Crawford turned out to be exactly who the voice had claimed, 47 years old, unemployed mine worker from Missouri, driving a blue 2003 Ford pickup that we found abandoned 2 miles away on County Road 12. No family to speak of, no reason to be in Millbrook County except for the handwritten note in his wallet advertising day labor at some construction site that didn't exist. The investigation went cold within a month. No witnesses, no suspects, no obvious motive. Thomas Eugene Crawford had driven into our little county and died there, and the only reason we found him at all was because someone, or something, had called it in over a radio frequency that, according to the FCC, wasn't supposed to exist. That should have been the end of it. Should have been just another unsolved case in a file cabinet that never gets opened. But 3 weeks later, the static came back. This time I was alone in the office, working late on budget reports that were already 2 months overdue. The radio had been quiet all evening, just the occasional check-in from our part-time deputy making his rounds. When that familiar crawling static filled the room, I knew what was coming before the voice emerged. Fire's going to start in the kitchen of the old diner on Main Street. Electrical short in the coffee machine, around 11:47 p.m. Flames will spread to the storage room before anyone notices. I looked at the clock on the wall, 11:31 p.m. Millie's Diner had been closed since 2018, but the building still stood on Main Street like a tooth in a dead man's skull. I'd driven past it twice that evening on patrol. Dark windows, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot, the same for sale sign that had been there for 4 years. I should have called the fire department. Should have followed procedure. Instead, I found myself walking out to my cruiser and driving the 8 blocks to Main Street with my radio turned up full volume. Something about that voice compelled attention, demanded witness. 11:47 p.m. found me parked across the street from Millie's, watching windows that had been dark for 3 years. At exactly 11:47, a flicker of orange light bloomed in what used to be the kitchen. By 11:52, smoke was pouring from under the storage room door. I called it in then, but the volunteer fire department took 20 minutes to respond, and by that time the entire building was involved. Nothing left but a blackened foundation and the smell of burned grease that lingered for weeks. The fire marshal's report blamed faulty electrical wiring in an old coffee machine that should have been disconnected years ago. Electrical short, just like the voice had said. Word gets around in a small town, even when you try to keep things quiet. Within a month, half the county knew their sheriff was getting predictions over the radio. I fielded calls from reporters, paranormal investigators, and one particularly persistent fellow from some cable television show who wanted to set up cameras in my office. I declined them all. Some things aren't meant for public consumption. The transmissions came irregularly after that, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes back-to-back nights that left me hollow-eyed and jumping at shadows. Always crimes, always accurate, always impossible to prevent. A break-in at the hardware store. Vandalism at the high school. Old Mrs. Patterson's heart attack while she was feeding her cats. That last one bothered me more than the rest. Heart attack isn't a crime, I told the radio when it finished describing how they'd find her on the kitchen floor with cat food scattered around her fallen body. But the voice never responded to questions, never acknowledged that anyone was listening. The thing about small towns is that they have long memories and short tempers for things that don't fit the normal pattern of life. By winter, I was catching looks from people who'd known me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Conversations that stopped when I walked into the post office. The kind of whispers that follow a man long after he's left the room. Mayor Hutchins called me into his office on a gray February morning when the snow was piled higher than the parking meters. People are saying things, Sheriff. People always say things. They're saying you're hearing voices. That you know things before they happen. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked like old bones. They're saying maybe you know too much about some of these incidents. I'd been waiting for this conversation since the 3rd transmission. In a place like Millbrook County, being different is almost as dangerous as being guilty. You think I'm involved in these crimes, Mayor? I think you're a good man who's been sheriff for a long time. Maybe too long. He opened a manila folder on his desk. Early retirement package. Full pension, healthcare benefits. Clean slate. The radio made a liar out of my retirement. 3 days after I cleaned out my desk and handed over my badge to Deputy Walsh, it transmitted my home address and described the break-in that would happen the following Tuesday. Perpetrator will enter through the kitchen window around 2:30 a.m. looking for something specific, documents or recordings related to the radio transmissions. Will search the basement and main floor before departing. I spent Monday night sitting in my darkened living room with my service weapon across my knees and every light in the house turned off. At 2:27 a.m., I heard the kitchen window sliding open. At 2:35, footsteps crossed my hardwood floors with the careful precision of someone who'd been watching the house long enough to know where the creaky boards were. Never saw his face. Black clothing, ski mask, moved like someone with military training. Spent 43 minutes searching my house while I sat perfectly still in the corner of my living room, watching a stranger rifle through 30 years of my life. He found the cassette tapes I'd started making of the transmissions after the third one. Took them all, along with my handwritten notes, and the frequency charts I'd been keeping. Left through the same kitchen window he'd entered, quiet as smoke. The radio fell silent after that night. No more static, no more impossible predictions. Just the ordinary sounds of a world going about its business without prophets or warnings. But silence, I learned, can be louder than voices. I moved away from Millbrook County 6 months later. Sold the house to a developer who turned it into a duplex rental and took a small place down in Tennessee where the mountains are old and the people mind their own business. Told myself I was done with impossible things and voices that knew too much. The radio followed me. Not the physical radio, that stayed in the sheriff's office for Walsh to puzzle over. But 3 weeks after I'd settled into my new place, I woke to static bleeding through the speakers of my clock radio. Same voice, older maybe, describing a car accident that would happen on Highway 70 at 3:17 a.m. I drove to Highway 70 and waited. At exactly 3:17, a drunk driver crossed the center line and hit a family of 4 head-on. I was first on the scene, administered CPR to a 6-year-old girl until the paramedics arrived. She lived, though the voice hadn't mentioned that part. That's when I understood the real horror of it. The radio wasn't just predicting crimes, it was recruiting witnesses. Making me complicit in its impossible knowledge, turning me into an instrument of whatever force was speaking through all that static. I've heard it in 4 different states now, over 7 years of running from a voice that knows my new address before I do. It doesn't matter what radio I'm near when it decides to speak. Clock radios, car stereos, even heard it once coming through a construction worker's boom box 3 blocks away from my apartment in Knoxville. The predictions are always accurate. Always unavoidable. Always just specific enough to make me a witness to things I can't prevent and couldn't explain if I tried. Sometimes I wonder if Thomas Eugene Crawford heard the same voice before he died. If somewhere, someone else is sitting in the dark with a radio they can't unplug, listening to descriptions of crimes that haven't happened yet, slowly going mad from the weight of impossible knowledge. The voice never tells me why. Never explains what purpose is served by knowing what can't be changed. It just speaks its truth into the static and leaves me to carry the weight of it. But I have a theory, born from too many sleepless nights and too many unexplainable incidents. I think the radio isn't predicting these things. I think it's remembering them. Broadcasting from some place where time moves differently, where past and future bleed together like watercolors in the rain. And I think it's getting stronger. The transmissions come more frequently now. Every few days instead of every few weeks. The voice sounds clearer, more present, as if whatever barrier exists between its world and ours is wearing thin. Last week, for the first time, it said my name. The sheriff will understand soon. The static is just the beginning. I've stopped running. Stop trying to outrun a voice that knows every road I'll travel and every place I'll call home. Instead, I wait. I listen. I bear witness to impossible things because something with knowledge beyond human understanding has decided that's my purpose. The radio is quiet tonight, but I can feel that familiar electric tension in the air that means transmission is coming. Somewhere out there, time is folding in on itself like paper, and a voice older than understanding is preparing to speak truths that haven't happened yet. I'll be listening when it does. Not because I want to, but because I've learned that some duties can't be abandoned, even after you've turned in your badge. The static is calling, and after all these years, I finally understand that I'm not just hearing predictions. I'm hearing instructions. The radio clicks to life as I finish writing this. The familiar static fills my small room, deeper now, more insistent. When the voice emerges, it's speaking directly to me, and the words it speaks make my blood turn to ice water in my veins. But that's another story. Another transmission. Another impossible truth that I'll carry alone into whatever darkness is coming. The static never lies. And tonight, it's got something new to say about the nature of time, the weight of witness, and what happens to sheriffs who know too much about crimes that exist in the spaces between what was and what will be. Some knowledge comes with a price. And some prices can only be paid in the currency of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. The voice is speaking now, describing something that makes all my previous experiences seem like practice for what's coming. But I suppose you'll have to tune in next time to hear about that. After all, some stories can only be told when the static decides it's time. End of transmission. I was the only one who noticed the map was changing. And the places it showed weren't abandoned for long. Let me tell you about the summer of '93, when I'd been sheriff of Millhaven for going on 23 years. 23 years of dealing with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in at Hendrick's hardware store. Nothing that would keep a man awake at night, nothing that would make him question the very ground he walked on. Until that map started showing me things that shouldn't exist. The map hung in my office, same place it had been since Sheriff Torino put it up in 1954. Standard surveyor's map of the township, mounted behind glass in a cherrywood frame that had seen better decades. Yellow at the edges, creased where someone had folded it wrong once upon a time, but accurate as the day it was printed. I'd stared at that thing countless times over the years, tracing routes to accident scenes, planning patrol coverage, checking property lines for boundary disputes. I knew every road, every building, every creek that snaked through our little corner of nowhere. That's why I noticed when Elm Street suddenly had a curve in it. It was a Tuesday morning in late June. Coffee was still hot in my cup, and I was reviewing the overnight reports, which consisted of Mrs. Patterson calling about teenagers parking behind the Methodist church again, when something made me look up at the map. Just a feeling, you understand? The kind of itch between your shoulder blades that tells you someone's watching, except there was no one there but me and the lazy flies buzzing against the window screen. Elm Street had always run straight as an arrow from Maine to the town limits. 3 blocks of identical houses built during the post-war boom, each one sitting on a quarter-acre lot with a narrow driveway and a mailbox at the curb. I could walk that street blindfolded and count my steps to every house. But on the map, Elm Street now curved left about halfway down, making a gentle S shape before straightening out again. Like it was avoiding something. I rubbed my eyes, figuring it was the morning light playing tricks. Maps don't change. Paper doesn't rearrange itself overnight. But when I looked again, that curve was still there, drawn in the same faded blue ink as the rest of the streets. I walked outside and drove to Elm Street. It was straight as it had always been. Standing there in the middle of the road, looking from one end to the other, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The kind of cold you get when you realize you're in over your head, when the rules you've lived by your whole life suddenly don't apply anymore. I walked the length of Elm Street twice, checking every house number, every landmark. Everything matched my memory perfectly. But that map back in my office showed something different. I didn't mention it to anyone. What would I say? That a 40-year-old map was updating itself? That I was seeing things that weren't there? I'd spent 2 decades building a reputation as a steady, reliable lawman. I wasn't about to throw that away over a trick of the light. But I started paying attention to that map in ways I never had before. 3 days later, I noticed the school. Millhaven Elementary sat at the corner of Pine and 3rd, a brick building from the 1960s with a flag pole out front and a playground that had seen better days. On the map, though, there was now a second building behind it. Smaller, connected by what looked like a covered walkway. The kind of addition you might build for extra classroom space or a new library. I drove over there during my lunch break. There was no second building. Just the original school, sitting alone on its lot like it always had. The grass behind it was brown and patchy where the maintenance crew had given up trying to make it grow in the shade of the old oak trees. But when I got back to the office, that second building was still there on the map. Clear as day, drawn in the same style as everything else. I started checking the map every morning when I came in, and every evening before I left. Watching it like you might watch a sick relative, waiting for signs of change. And change it did, slowly but surely. A new street would appear, branching off from somewhere that made sense, leading to houses that looked like they belonged. A small park where there had never been one. A second entrance to the cemetery on the north side of town. Each time, I would drive out to verify what I was seeing. Each time, reality disagreed with the map. But here's the thing that kept me awake at night. The changes weren't random. They had a logic to them, a purpose. The new streets connected neighborhoods that had always felt isolated. The additional buildings filled gaps that I'd never consciously noticed but somehow felt. It was as if the map was showing me what the town should have been, or maybe what it wanted to become. By the middle of July, I was visiting the map 3 or 4 times a day. My deputy, Crawford, started giving me looks when I'd interrupt conversations to check on it. But I couldn't help myself. The town on that map was growing, evolving, becoming something more complete than the place I'd spent my life protecting. The first person disappeared on a Thursday. Margaret Cosley lived alone in the yellow house at the end of Maple Street, had lived there for 37 years since her husband died in Vietnam. Every Thursday morning, she walked to Brennan's Market for groceries, same route, same time, precise as clockwork. I'd seen her make that walk hundreds of times over the years. That Thursday, she never made it to the store. We found her reading glasses on the sidewalk 2 blocks from her house, right where Maple Street intersected with a narrow lane called Sycamore Drive. The problem was, there had never been a Sycamore Drive in Millhaven. I knew every street in town by heart, had driven them all countless times. But on the map in my office, Sycamore Drive was clearly marked. A thin line branching off from Maple, leading to what looked like a small cluster of houses nestled among trees that were drawn with more detail than anything else on the entire map. I stood at that intersection for an hour, staring at the empty lot where Sycamore Drive should have been. Nothing but scrub grass and the foundation of a house that had burned down before I was born. But Margaret's glasses were right there on the sidewalk, perfectly positioned where someone might drop them if they suddenly turned to look down a street that shouldn't exist. We searched for 3 days. Checked every house, every basement, every old root cellar in the county. Put her picture on the news, contacted her sister in Portland, talked to everyone who'd seen her in the past month. Margaret Cosley had simply vanished, as completely as if she'd never existed at all. Except for those glasses, sitting at the mouth of a street that existed only on paper. The second disappearance happened 2 weeks later. Tommy Reeves was 16, worked summers at his uncle's garage, spent most of his free time fishing the creek that ran behind the industrial district. His mother called when he didn't come home for dinner, said he'd gone out around noon with his tackle box and hadn't been seen since. We found his bicycle beside the creek, but not where anyone would expect to find it. It was sitting next to a small wooden bridge that crossed the water about a quarter-mile upstream from where Tommy usually fished. A neat little covered bridge, painted white with green trim, the kind you might see on a postcard from Vermont. The thing is, there had never been a bridge there. The creek ran through a section of town that was mostly abandoned lots and the backs of old warehouses. People dumped their trash there sometimes, but nobody had built anything nice enough to bother painting. But on the map, that bridge was marked with a small symbol that hadn't been there before. And beneath it, in lettering so small I needed a magnifying glass to read it, were the words, "Founders Crossing." I'd lived in Millhaven my entire life, had heard every story the old-timers told about the early days. There had never been anything called Founders Crossing. When I went back to check on the bridge the next morning, it was gone. Just the creek running through the weeds like always, and Tommy's bicycle tire tracks in the mud where something had been. But on the map, Founders Crossing remained. By August, I was the only one who seemed to notice that people were vanishing. Oh, families reported their missing loved ones, and we went through the motions of searching and investigating. But somehow, after a few days, everyone seemed to forget. They'd stop asking questions, stop checking in for updates. It was as if the disappeared had been edited out of everyone's memory except mine. The map, meanwhile, continued to evolve. New streets appeared with increasing frequency, connecting parts of town that had never been linked before. Buildings sprouted in empty lots, parks bloomed where there had been nothing but scrub. The map was showing me a version of Millhaven that was more complete, more perfect than the place I knew. And people kept disappearing at the edges of these new additions. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I observed, making my own map of where people had vanished and what new features had appeared on the official map. The pattern was becoming clear. The town was growing, but it needed something from us to fuel that growth. It needed us. The breakthrough came when I decided to research the map itself. I'd always assumed it was just a standard surveyor's map, the kind any town might have. But when I looked closer at the bottom corner, I found something I'd never noticed before, a small signature in faded brown ink. E. Sallow, 1954. Ezra Sallow had been the town's first and only surveyor, brought in during the post-war development boom to map out the new residential areas. He'd lived in Millhaven for exactly 1 year, long enough to complete his contract, then disappeared one autumn night in 1955. Left behind a house full of surveying equipment and maps of places that didn't exist. I found his files in the town hall basement, boxes of documents that no one had touched in decades. Most of it was standard surveying notes, property boundaries, elevation measurements. But buried in the middle was a leather journal filled with sketches and observations that made my blood run cold. Sallow had been documenting changes to the town that no one else could see. Streets that shifted position overnight. Buildings that appeared and disappeared. He'd even drawn pictures of the residents he claimed were temporary, people who were there one day and forgotten the next. The final entry was dated 3 days before he vanished. The town is dreaming. It dreams of what it could be, what it should be. The map is the dream made manifest. But dreams require sacrifice. They require fuel. I understand now why I was brought here. I understand what I was meant to do. Below that, in handwriting that was barely legible, I am the cartographer. I show the way. I closed the journal and sat in that dusty basement for a long time, listening to the buildings settle around me. Outside, Millhaven went about its business, unaware that it was slowly being replaced by something else. Something that existed primarily in the space between what was real and what was possible. That night, I made a decision that I've regretted every day since. I was going to destroy the map. It seemed simple enough. Remove the map from its frame, burn it in the parking lot behind the station, let whatever strange force was at work find another way to express itself. Maybe the disappearances would stop. Maybe the town would go back to being just a normal place where normal things happened. I stayed late at the office, waiting until Crawford and the night deputy had finished their shift change. Then I carefully removed the map from its frame, rolled it up, and carried it outside. But when I unrolled it under the street light, I saw something that made me stop cold. The map now showed the entire county, not just Millhaven. And scattered throughout were dozens of small towns, each one connected to the others by roads that glowed faintly in the darkness. Some of the towns were marked with red dots. Others were crossed out entirely. At the bottom of the map, in that same brown ink, were new words. The network expands. The dream spreads. Each town dreams for the next. I looked closer at the red dots and realized they marked places I'd heard about in passing conversations with other sheriffs. Towns where people had been disappearing. Towns where strange things were happening that no one could quite explain. And at the center of it all was Millhaven, connected to every other place by those glowing roads. I understood then that destroying the map wouldn't stop anything. The process had moved beyond needing that particular piece of paper. It had taken root in the town itself, in the space between what people remembered and what they chose to forget. I rolled the map back up and returned it to its frame. The next morning, Crawford didn't come to work. His wife called, confused, asking if we'd changed his schedule. She seemed to think he'd been assigned to a different district, though she couldn't remember which one or when the transfer had happened. On the map, a new street had appeared leading from the station to a small cluster of buildings labeled Administrative District. Buildings I'd never seen but somehow felt familiar, as if I'd walked their halls many times before. That was 15 years ago. I'm retired now, living in a small apartment above Brennan's Market. The new sheriff is a young man named Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's boy, though she doesn't seem to remember having a son who went into law enforcement. He's good at his job, handles the routine calls with the same steady competence I once brought to the work. He's also the only one who seems to notice when the map changes. I see him sometimes, standing in front of it with that same confused expression I must have worn all those years ago, trying to reconcile what he's seeing with what he knows to be true. I could warn him, could show him Sallow's journal, could explain what's happening to our town and all the towns like it. But I don't. Because I've come to understand that the map isn't destroying Millhaven. It's perfecting it. Each person who disappears into those phantom streets and impossible buildings becomes part of something larger, something more complete than what we had before. The town is becoming what it was always meant to be, and we are becoming what we were always meant to become. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear them. The disappeared. They're not gone, not really. They're just living in the spaces between what is and what could be, helping to build something that exists just outside the boundaries of normal perception. And sometimes, when I walk the streets of Millhaven in the early morning hours, I catch glimpses of the other version. The perfect version. Streets that curve in ways that make sense. Buildings that fill the gaps in our skyline. Parks where children play games that were never quite forgotten. The map in the sheriff's office changes almost nightly now, Patterson has started keeping notes, just like I did, just like Sallow did before us. He'll figure it out eventually, same as we all do. He'll understand that some things can't be stopped, only managed. And when his time comes, when the town decides it needs a new cartographer, he'll make the same choice we all made. He'll become part of the dream, part of the process that's slowly perfecting every small town in America, one impossible street at a time. The map is never wrong, you see. It just shows us places that don't exist yet. But they will. They always do. I can hear them building now, in the spaces between sleep and waking, between memory and forgetting. The sound of hammers and saws, of voices calling to each other in languages that are almost familiar. They're preparing for the next phase, the next expansion of the dream. And somewhere in all that construction, in all that careful planning, I think I can hear Ezra Sallow laughing. The sound echoes through streets that exist only on paper, through buildings that cast shadows on nothing at all. He was the first cartographer, but he won't be the last. None of us will be the last. The map keeps changing, keeps growing, keeps showing us what we're going to become. And one by one, we'll all find our way to those streets that appear overnight, those buildings that shouldn't exist but do. Because the town is dreaming. And dreams, once they take hold, never really end. They just keep getting bigger. This story is part of the Sheriff Paranormal Files series. If you've experienced similar phenomena in your town, or if you've noticed changes to local maps that others seem to overlook, document everything and trust your instincts. Sometimes the only way to survive the impossible is to accept that it's possible after all. It wasn't there when he left. And it wasn't his blood. That's what Deputy Marcus told me when he walked into the station that Tuesday morning in September, his face the color of old newspaper. I'd been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years by then, seen my share of peculiar things in a town where the cemetery outnumbers the living 3-1. But there was something in Marcus's eyes that morning, something that made the coffee in my stomach turn sour. The handprint was pressed against the inside of the passenger window of Unit 7, fingers splayed wide like someone had been trying to claw their way out. Or in. The blood had dried to a rusty brown, the kind you see on old farm tools left too long in the rain. But this wasn't rust, and it sure as hell wasn't paint. Marcus stood beside his patrol car in the station parking lot, hands shaking as he lit his third cigarette since arriving. The September sun was already hot enough to make the asphalt shimmer, but he kept rubbing his arms like he was cold. "Tell me again what happened," I said, though I'd already heard it twice. "I made my usual rounds yesterday evening. Checked on the Brennan place, drove past the old mill, circled through town twice. Normal stuff." His voice had that hollow quality you hear in men who've seen too much. "When I got back to the station around midnight, I locked up the car and went home. This morning I come back and—" He gestured weakly at the window. I walked around to the passenger side and crouched down. The handprint was perfect, too perfect. You could see the individual ridges of the fingerprints, the lifeline creases in the palm. It was the hand of someone tall, with long fingers. An adult. The blood had pooled slightly at the base of each finger where it met the glass, as if whoever made it had pressed hard, desperately. "You sure you didn't pick anyone up? Maybe someone who was hurt?" Marcus shook his head hard enough to make his cigarette ash scatter. "Nobody. I swear on my mother's grave, Sheriff. Nobody got in that car but me." I believed him. Marcus was green, barely 2 years on the force, but he wasn't a liar. Besides, there were other things that didn't make sense. The handprint was on the inside, yes, but there was no corresponding print on the outside of the glass. No smears on the door handle. No blood anywhere else in the car. Just that one perfect print, like someone had materialized inside the vehicle just long enough to press their hand against the window and vanish again. The town of Millbrook has always been a strange place. Settled in 1847 by folks who claimed they were following God's word into the wilderness, though most suspected they were running from something altogether different. The original settlement was built in a natural depression between three hills, with Crow Creek winding through it like a serpent. The old-timers used to say the hills kept the evil in, but I always figured they kept it out. Now I'm not so sure about either. We've got more churches per capita than any other town in the state, 7 of them for a population that's never topped 1,500. Most are abandoned now, their steeples pointing accusingly at a sky that never seems quite the right color here. The Methodist Church still holds services, and Father Mackenzie says Mass at St. Bartholomew's every Sunday for the 12 Catholics left in town. But it's the old fundamentalist chapel at the edge of town that draws the most attention, though nobody's held services there since 1962. That's the year the Hendricks family disappeared. All 5 of them, mother, father, 3 children, gone without a trace from their farmhouse 2 miles north of town. The house stood empty for decades, slowly rotting into the ground like a bad tooth. Kids would dare each other to spend the night there, but none ever made it past sunset. They'd come running back to town, pale and shaking, talking about voices in the walls and footsteps in the attic. The fundamentalist chapel was where the Hendricks family worshipped, and after they vanished, people started noticing things. The door would creak open on windless nights. Lights would flicker in the windows when the power had been cut for years. And sometimes, on Sunday mornings, you could hear singing, faint and mournful, drifting down from the hills like smoke. I mention all this because Marcus's patrol route took him past both the Hendricks place and the old chapel every night. After we'd photographed the handprint from every angle and dusted for prints that weren't there, I sent Marcus home and told him to take the rest of the week off. He didn't argue. There's a look a man gets when he's seen something that doesn't fit into the neat categories his mind has built for the world. Marcus had that look. I spent the afternoon making calls to the state crime lab, knowing they'd find nothing useful. Blood type, DNA if we were lucky, but blood can tell you a lot of things. It can't tell you why it appeared inside a locked car with no explanation, or why the person who left it managed to do so without leaving any other trace of their existence. The lab results came back 3 days later. Type O negative, common enough. But there was something else, something that made the lab technician's voice sound strained over the phone. "Sheriff, I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." "What do you mean?" "The cellular structure of the blood, it's degraded. Extensively. Like it's been dead for a long time." "How long?" A pause. "Based on the level of deterioration? I'd say at least 20 years. Maybe more. But that's impossible, because fresh blood doesn't maintain this kind of cohesion after that level of cellular breakdown. It should have been powder by now." I thanked him and hung up, staring out my office window at the 3 hills that surrounded our town like sleeping giants. 20 years. That would put us right around 1962, the year the Hendricks family disappeared. That evening, I drove out to take a look at what was left of their farmhouse. The structure had finally collapsed completely the previous winter, leaving only the stone foundation and the old well. But the chapel was still standing, its white clapboard siding gray with age and weather. The front door hung slightly ajar, though I could have sworn it had been properly closed the last time I'd been out this way. I sat in my patrol car as the sun set behind the western hills, watching shadows creep across the valley floor like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. There's a quality to the silence in Millbrook that you don't find other places. Too complete, too heavy. As if the air itself is holding its breath. The singing started just after full dark. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of insects and the distant hum of the highway. But as I rolled down my windows and listened, it became clearer. 4 or 5 voices, maybe more, rising and falling in what might have been a hymn. The melody was unfamiliar, but there was something almost hypnotic about it, something that made you want to get out of your car and walk toward it. I didn't. Instead, I started my engine and drove back to town, trying to ignore the way my hands shook on the steering wheel. The next morning brought news that made everything worse. Betty Carlson, who ran the diner on Main Street, came into the station around 8 o'clock. She was crying, which wasn't unusual for Betty. She cried at sad movies, at wedding announcements, at the thought of her cat getting old. But this was different. "It's my Jimmy," she said, clutching a tissue. "He didn't come home last night." Jimmy was Betty's 17-year-old son, a good kid who never given anyone trouble. He worked part-time at the hardware store and helped his mother with the diner. Not the type to run off without telling anyone. "When did you last see him?" "Yesterday evening, around 6. He said he was going for a drive, maybe stop by Sarah Miller's place." Sarah was Jimmy's girlfriend, a sweet girl who lived on the other side of town. "I called her this morning. He never showed up." We organized a search party that included most of the men in town and a few of the women who insisted on helping. Millbrook is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and when someone goes missing, it becomes everyone's concern. We found Jimmy's car around noon, parked at the edge of Crow Creek about half a mile from the old chapel. The keys were still in the ignition, his wallet on the dashboard, $43 untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that he'd been forced to leave the vehicle. His footprints led away from the car toward the creek, then simply stopped. Not faded. Not obscured by other tracks. They just stopped, as if Jimmy had taken a step into empty air and vanished. The search continued until well after dark, with the state police bringing in dogs and helicopters. They found nothing. No trace of Jimmy Carlson, no indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. He had simply ceased to exist somewhere between his car and the creek. I was standing by the water, watching the search teams pack up their equipment, when Deputy Marcus appeared beside me. He was off duty, but he joined the search anyway. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "there's something I didn't tell you about that night." I waited. "When I was making my rounds, I saw Jimmy's car. It was parked right here, same spot where we found it today. But that was around 10 o'clock, not 6. And I could see someone sitting in the passenger seat." My blood went cold. "You're sure?" "Positive." I slowed down, thinking maybe he and Sarah had come out here to, well, you know. But when I got closer, I could see it wasn't Sarah. It was someone taller. Someone with long arms and pale skin. They were just sitting there, not moving. "Did you stop?" Marcus shook his head. "I should have, but something told me not to. Call it instinct, call it cowardice. I kept driving. But I watched in my rearview mirror, and I could see that figure turn its head to watch me go. Even from that distance, I could tell it was smiling." The next few days passed in a blur of interviews and paperwork and sleepless nights. The state police took over the investigation, bringing in experts and equipment that made our small-town operation look primitive by comparison. They found nothing we hadn't already found, which is to say they found nothing at all. But strange things started happening around town. Mrs. Patterson, who lived alone in the house behind the Methodist church, called to report footsteps on her roof in the middle of the night. When I went to check, I found muddy prints that didn't match any boot I'd ever seen, too long, with indentations where the toes should be. The Henderson's dog, a friendly golden retriever that had never shown aggression toward anyone, attacked the mailman for no apparent reason. When they took it to the vet, Dr. Reeves said the animal was in perfect health but appeared to be terrified of something only it could see. And every night, right around sunset, people reported hearing that singing coming from the direction of the old chapel. Not everyone heard it. It seemed to depend on where you were standing and which way the wind was blowing. But those who did hear it described the same thing, 4 or 5 voices, harmonizing on a melody that made your skin crawl and your teeth ache. I started driving out to the chapel every evening, parking where I could see the building and the surrounding area. Most nights, nothing happened. But on Thursday, exactly 1 week after we'd found the handprint in Marcus's patrol car, I saw something that convinced me we were dealing with forces beyond normal police work. The sun had set behind the hills, leaving the valley in that purple twilight that comes just before full darkness. I was sitting in my car, windows down, listening to the sounds of the countryside, insects, a distant train whistle, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Peaceful sounds. Normal sounds. Then the singing started. This time it was closer, louder, and I could make out some of the words. They weren't in English, or any language I recognized, but there was something familiar about the rhythm, something that reminded me of the old hymns my grandmother used to sing when I was a child. As I listened, figures began to emerge from the chapel. 5 of them, walking in single file down the front steps and across the weedy yard. They moved slowly, deliberately, like people in a procession. In the fading light, I could see they were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, long dresses for the women, dark suits for the men. They looked like a family from 50 or 60 years ago, the kind you might see in an old photograph. They walked to the edge of the property and stopped, standing in a line facing the road. Facing me. Even from 100 yards away, I could see they were all unnaturally tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Their faces were indistinct, but I had the impression they were smiling. The singing continued, rising and falling in waves that seemed to wash over me like a physical force. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like hearing angels singing about damnation. I found myself reaching for the door handle, wanting to get out of the car and walk toward them. That's when I saw the blood. It was flowing down the inside of my windshield in thin red streams, as if someone with bleeding hands was pressed against the glass from the inside. But there was no one in the car with me. I was alone, just as Marcus had been alone in his patrol car that night. The blood began to form patterns as it flowed, letters, maybe, or symbols I didn't recognize. Ancient-looking marks that hurt to look at directly. I fumbled for my radio, trying to call for backup, but all I got was static and what sounded like voices whispering in that same unknown language. The figures by the chapel raised their arms in unison, and the singing reached a crescendo that made my windows vibrate. The blood on my windshield began to move faster, forming more complex patterns that seemed to shift and change even as I watched. Then, suddenly, it all stopped. The singing cut off mid-note. The figures vanished like smoke. The blood on my windshield disappeared without a trace. I was alone in my patrol car on a dark country road, with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing to prove that any of it had happened. I drove back to town that night with my hands clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles cramped. The next morning, I requested emergency assistance from the state police and contacted a specialist I'd heard about, a man named Garrett who dealt with what he called unusual phenomena. Garrett arrived on Saturday, a thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He spent an hour listening to my account, asking occasional questions but mostly just nodding like he'd heard similar stories before. "Has anyone else in town reported seeing these figures?" he asked. "Not directly. But people have been hearing the singing, and there have been other incidents." "What kind of incidents?" I told him about the footprints on Mrs. Patterson's roof, about the Hendersons' dog, about the general feeling of unease that had settled over the town like a fog. He made notes in a small black notebook, his handwriting too cramped for me to read. "I'd like to visit the chapel," he said when I'd finished. "Tonight, if possible." "I don't think that's a good idea." He looked up from his notebook, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of a man standing at the edge of a cliff. "Sheriff, I've been investigating cases like this for 20 years. If what you've told me is accurate, then something very old and very dangerous has awakened in your town. It won't go away on its own." That evening, we drove out to the chapel together. Garrett had brought a bag of equipment that looked like a cross between scientific instruments and medieval torture devices. He set up cameras and recording equipment while I kept watch, my service weapon drawn, though I doubted bullets would be much use against whatever we were dealing with. The sun set behind the hills right on schedule, and as darkness settled over the valley, we waited. We didn't have to wait long. The singing started at 8:17 p.m., according to Garrett's equipment. This time there were more voices, 7 or 8, maybe more. They sang in harmony, their voices blending into something that was both beautiful and utterly alien. Garrett's instruments began recording, needles jumping on dials I didn't understand. "They're here," he whispered. The figures emerged from the chapel just as they had the night before, but this time there were more of them. A dozen or more, all tall and pale and wrong-looking in ways I couldn't put into words. They walked in procession across the yard and formed a semicircle facing the road. Facing us. "The Hendricks family," Garrett said quietly. "Plus others. They've been here all along, trapped between this world and whatever lies beyond. What do they want? To finish what they started. To complete the ritual they began before they disappeared." As if they'd heard him, the figures raised their arms and the singing intensified. The air around us began to thicken, taking on a quality I'd never experienced before, like breathing through water, but water that burned your lungs and made your vision blur. Blood began to appear on the windshield of my patrol car, just as it had the night before. But this time it wasn't random patterns. This time it was writing clear messages in English. "Come to US. Join the choir. Sing with US forever." Garrett's equipment was going crazy, beeping and clicking like a pinball machine. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," he said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "They're trying to breach the barrier between dimensions. Can you stop them? Maybe. But not from here. We need to get inside the chapel." The idea of walking into that building filled me with a dread deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. But as I watched the figures in the yard continue their impossible ritual, as I saw more blood appear on the windows of nearby cars that had been abandoned by other investigators, I knew we had no choice. We left the patrol car and walked across the yard toward the chapel. The singing grew louder with each step, and I could feel it in my bones now, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my chest. The figures watched us approach but didn't move to stop us. They just kept singing, their pale faces turned toward us like flowers following the sun. The chapel door was standing wide open, though I was certain it had been closed when we arrived. Inside, candles had been lit despite the fact that there was no electricity to the building. They cast dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that moved independently of the flames that created them. At the front of the chapel, where the altar should have been, stood a circle of stones covered in symbols that hurt to look at. In the center of the circle was a depression in the floor, stained dark with what could only be blood. "This is where it started," Garrett said, pulling a device from his bag that looked like a cross between a compass and a Geiger counter. "In 1962, the Hendricks family tried to summon something. They succeeded, but the cost was higher than they expected." "What did they summon?" Something from a place where the rules of our reality don't apply. Something that exists in the spaces between seconds, in the silence between notes of music. It consumed them, but it couldn't cross over completely because the ritual was interrupted. By what? Garrett looked at me with those haunted eyes. By Jimmy Carlson's grandfather. He was the sheriff then, and he came to investigate reports of strange lights and sounds coming from the chapel. He found the Hendricks family in the middle of their summoning, and he did the only thing he could think of. Which was? He broke the circle. Outside, the singing was reaching a crescendo. Through the windows of the chapel, I could see more figures appearing, dozens of them, materializing out of the darkness like photographs developing in slow motion. They were all tall and pale and wrong, and they were all walking toward the chapel. But breaking the circle didn't banish the entity. Garrett continued, working frantically with his equipment. It just trapped it here, along with the souls of everyone it had already claimed. For 60 years, it's been trying to complete the summoning. And now it's found a way. He nodded grimly. The blood in the patrol cars isn't random. It's a beacon, a way for the entity to mark potential vessels. It's building a new congregation, one soul at a time. The figures outside had reached the chapel and were filing through the door. Up close, I could see that they weren't quite human. Their proportions were wrong, their faces too long, their fingers ending in points rather than fingernails. But I could still recognize some of them. Jimmy Carlson walked among them, his face pale and slack but his eyes burning with an inner fire. Behind him came others, people who had disappeared from Millbrook over the years, people whose cases had been filed away as unsolved mysteries. They arranged themselves in a circle around the stone altar, their voices joining the supernatural choir that filled the chapel with sound. Garrett finished setting up his equipment and turned to me. When I give the signal, you need to step into the circle and destroy the altar. It's the focal point of their power. What about you? I'll try to disrupt their ritual long enough for you to work. He pulled a small silver cross from his pocket and began muttering in what sounded like Latin. Whatever happens, don't listen to their song. Don't let it get inside your head. But it was already too late for that. The music was in my bones now, in my blood, and I could feel it changing something fundamental about the way I saw the world. The shadows on the walls were no longer shadows but doorways. The candle flames were no longer flames but eyes. And the faces of the congregation. The faces of the congregation were beautiful. I understood now why Jimmy had gotten out of his car and walked toward the creek. Why the Hendricks family had gathered in this chapel 60 years ago to attempt something that should have been impossible. The entity they were trying to summon wasn't evil, not in any way we would understand. It was simply from a place where love and horror were the same thing, where joining with something greater than yourself required the complete destruction of everything you had been. Garrett shouted something and his equipment began emitting a high-pitched whine that cut through the singing like a knife. The congregation faltered, their perfect harmony disrupted, and I saw my chance. I pushed through the circle of figures, their cold fingers brushing against my arms as I passed. The stone altar was carved with symbols that seemed to move when I looked directly at them, and the depression in the center was filled with blood that was still warm despite having been spilled decades ago. I raised my service weapon and fired 3 shots into the center of the altar. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The stones exploded in a shower of fragments that cut my face and hands. The blood in the depression boiled and steamed, filling the chapel with a smell like burning copper. And the congregation screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of wind through empty spaces, of time folding in on itself, of reality tearing like paper. The figures began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart like smoke. But as they faded, I could see their true faces, not the pale, beautiful masks they had worn, but the twisted, agonized expressions of souls trapped between worlds for longer than they could remember. Jimmy Carlson was the last to go. As his form began to fade, he looked directly at me and mouthed a single word. "Thanks." Then he was gone, and the chapel was empty except for Garrett and myself, and the smell of ozone and burnt offerings. We stumbled out into the night, both of us bleeding from stone fragments and exhausted in ways that went deeper than physical fatigue. The chapel behind us was already beginning to crumble, its walls sagging inward as if the building itself had been held together only by the force of the entity's will. The drive back to town was silent. There was nothing to say, really. How do you explain to people that their missing friends and family members had been trapped in a nightmare for decades? How do you write a report about breaking up a supernatural congregation and destroying an interdimensional entity? You don't. You file the cases as unsolved and hope that whoever comes after you never has to deal with something similar. That was 20 years ago. I retired the following spring and moved to Florida, where the sun shines every day and the shadows are normal shadows that don't move on their own. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I still hear that singing. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone on dark roads, I see handprints on the inside of my windshield, pale and desperate, pressed against the glass by hands that exist somewhere between this world and whatever lies beyond. The chapel is gone now, torn down by the county after the foundation shifted and made the building unsafe. They built a small park where it used to stand, with benches and a playground where children can play safely in the daylight. But the locals know better than to go there after dark. Some places hold on to their secrets, even after the buildings are gone and the people who knew the truth have moved away or died. Millbrook is one of those places. It always has been, and it always will be. The hills still keep the evil in. Or maybe they keep it out. I'm still not sure which is worse. Yandy.